The mare's scream tore through the midnight silence like a blade through silk. It was the kind of sound that bypassed thought entirely and went straight to the oldest part of the brain, the part that remembered what it meant when an animal screamed like that in the darkness. Something was dying, something was fighting to live, and the line between those two things was thinner than breath. When Laurel ran barefoot into that barn, her nightgown soaked through with sweat and barn dust clinging to every fold of fabric, three mountain men who had spent weeks building walls of careful distance realized in one shattering instant that every boundary they had constructed was about to come apart. What happened in the hours that followed would bind four people together in ways that defied every rule of civilized society. Ways that would be whispered about in drawing rooms from Philadelphia to San Francisco. Ways that would be condemned by preachers and celebrated by no one except the people who lived it. But before we dive into how a proper Philadelphia governess became the claimed wife of three brothers in the Colorado wilderness, go ahead and smash that like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from tonight. Trust me, you will not want to miss a single moment of this story. Because what happened on Kestrel Peak Ranch in the winter of 1885 changed everything these four people thought they knew about love survival and what a family could be. Now let me take you back to where it all began. November 1885, Philadelphia. The lock on Cordelia Pembroke's mahogany desk yielded with a soft click that sounded like thunder in the midnight silence of the house. Laurel Prescott's hands trembled as she worked the bent hairpin, a skill learned from a stable boy named Tobias, when she was 12 years old back when her parents were alive, and she had been allowed to be curious and wild and unafraid of the world. 2 nights before her wedding to Aldrich Whitfield, 2 nights before they would close the cage door forever and throw away the key. The drawer slid open with the whisper of oiled wood revealing neat stacks of correspondence tied with ribbon, a leather journal with Cordelia's initials pressed into the cover, and tucked in the far back corner, where it would not be easily noticed, a small metal box with a brass clasp. Laurel lifted it with both hands, feeling the weight of it settle in her palms like a promise or perhaps a prayer. Inside, she found $63 in bills and coins, more than enough for a stage ticket west with a little left over for emergencies. She took it all. Her hands did not shake when she closed the box and returned it to its hiding place. They did not shake when she slid the drawer shut and heard the lock click back into position. Whatever guilt she might have felt was buried beneath something far more powerful than guilt. Desperation. The kind that turns good women into thieves and quiet women into runaways and proper women into something the world does not have a name for yet. Let Aunt Cordelia explain to Aldrich why his young bride had fled in the night like a criminal. Let them both choke on their fury and their wounded pride. Let Philadelphia society whisper and judge and cluck their tongues over tea and scones. None of it mattered anymore. Nothing mattered except the advertisement folded inside her copy of Wordsworth's collected poems, the one she had torn from the Philadelphia Inquirer 3 weeks ago, with hands that shook so badly she nearly tore the paper in half. She had read it so many times she could recite it from memory, every word burned into her mind like scripture. Mail order bride needed. Kestrel Peak Ranch, Colorado Territory. Respectable rancher seeks educated woman for marriage. 3 daughters require mothering and instruction. Isolated mountain location. Generous provision, room and board protection, guaranteed. The words had felt like salvation when she first read them. Sitting in the servant's kitchen at 2 in the morning, the newspaper spread across her lap, her eyes blurring with tears she would not let fall. 3 daughters who needed a mother. An educated woman wanted. Isolated mountain location where no one from Philadelphia would ever think to look. Those words felt like freedom now. Tasted like it. Sharp and clean and terrifying. Laurel tucked the money inside the hollowed pages of her poetry book, the same hiding place she had used as a child to keep secrets from her mother. Little things then, a robin's feather, a note from a school friend, a pressed flower from the garden where she used to read for hours, innocent secrets from an innocent time. But mother was 3 years dead now, killed alongside father in a train derailment outside Harrisburg on a cold morning in November. The same month, Laurel realized with a chill, the same season of dying. 3 years since Cordelia Pembroke had swept into Laurel's life like a vulture descending on a fresh carcass, all black silk and tight lips and the sharp perfume of lilies that Laurel would forever associate with grief. Cordelia had pronounced herself Laurel's savior, had taken control of the modest estate Laurel's parents left behind, had installed herself in their home, and turned their daughter into something between an unpaid servant and a display piece useful for fetching tea and looking presentable when visitors arrived. 6 months ago, Cordelia had arranged the marriage, had sat Laurel down in the parlor with the good china and the stiff-backed chairs and announced it as if she were announcing the weather. A simple fact, an inevitability, not a question, but a conclusion. Aldrich Whitfield, 40 years old, wealthy from shipping investments that Laurel suspected were not entirely legal, a man with wet hands that lingered too long on her waist when he guided her through doorways, a man whose smile showed too much gum and whose eyes showed too little soul, a man who had spoken of wifely duties at their engagement dinner while his fingers crept higher on her thigh beneath the damask tablecloth, each inch a territorial claim, each squeeze a preview of ownership. Laurel had excused herself from that dinner table with careful grace, had walked with measured steps to the garden, had vomited into the rose bushes while the sound of laughter and clinking glasses drifted through the windows behind her. She looked at the wedding dress now hanging in her wardrobe like a ghost waiting to be inhabited. White silk gleaming in the candlelight, catching and releasing tiny points of light with each flicker of the flame. Beautiful, everyone said. Exquisite craftsmanship. Worth a fortune. It looked like a burial shroud. Tomorrow she was supposed to put it on. Tomorrow she was supposed to walk down the aisle of St. Mark's Cathedral with Cordelia's hand clamped on her arm like a manacle and speak vows that would bind her to Aldrich Whitfield until death parted them. And knowing Aldrich's death might come sooner rather than later. Not his death, hers. The slow death of a spirit crushed under the weight of a life she never chose. Tomorrow she would be gone. Laurel changed quickly, stripping off her nightgown and pulling on her gray traveling dress, the plainest thing she owned. Gray wool, high collar, long sleeves, not a single ornament or embellishment. The kind of dress that made a woman invisible, which was precisely what Laurel needed to be for the next 6 days. She packed a small bag with ruthless efficiency, selecting only what she could carry and what she could not bear to leave behind. 2 spare dresses, both gray, both severe. Undergarments, a pair of sturdy boots, and then the things that mattered more than clothing. The pearl necklace her mother had given her on her 18th birthday, the one possession Cordelia had not managed to confiscate because Laurel kept it hidden in the lining of her mattress. She held it in her palm for a moment, feeling the smooth weight of each pearl, remembering her mother's fingers fastening the clasp at the back of her neck. Remembering her mother's voice warm and low saying, "You are going to do extraordinary things, my darling girl." The poetry book with its hidden fortune went into the bag next. Then at the last moment, she added her teaching certificates from Preston Academy. 2 years of rigorous study, literature, languages, mathematics, music. Everything a young lady of quality should know, and everything a governess should be able to teach. Evidence of who she had been trained to be, even if that person had never quite fit the shape society demanded. The note she left on her pillow was brief. She wrote it quickly because lingering over words would mean lingering over doubts, and she could not afford either. "I cannot marry Mr. Whitfield. Please do not search for me." She signed it only with her initials, LP, as if by abbreviating her name she could abbreviate her guilt, as if becoming smaller on paper could make her disappearance less of a wound. The back stairs creaked under her weight, each groan of old wood a potential betrayal. But the house remained silent. Cordelia slept the sleep of the self-righteous in her bedroom at the front of the house, the heavy curtains drawn against the November cold, secure in her absolute belief that tomorrow would proceed exactly as planned, that girls like Laurel Prescott did not run, that proper young ladies accepted their fates with grace and gratitude and never once questioned the wisdom of the people who decided those fates for them. Cordelia Pembroke did not know her niece at all. Laurel stepped into the November night, and the cold hit her like an open hand. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, adjusted the strap of her bag, and walked down the street without looking back. Not once. Not even when the house where she had been born and raised and orphaned disappeared behind her in the darkness. Looking back was for people who had something to return to. The stage station on Market Street was nearly empty at 2 in the morning. A bored clerk with ink-stained fingers sat behind the counter, reading a dime novel by the light of a guttering oil lamp. A drunk slept on a bench near the door, his snoring the only sound in the waiting room besides a tick of a clock on the wall. Laurel purchased her ticket with cash, giving a false name, Sarah Jennings. The clerk barely glanced at her. She was just another woman traveling west, and in 1885, there were plenty of those. Women running towards something, women running from something, women who had learned that the difference between those two things was often just a matter of perspective. By dawn, she was 30 miles west of Philadelphia, rattling through Pennsylvania farmland in a stagecoach that smelled of leather and tobacco and the particular staleness of confined human bodies. She watched through the small window as the sun rose over frost-covered fields, painting the world in shades of gold and amber and the cold white of early winter. The landscape looked like freedom. 6 days on a stagecoach felt like 6 years. The journey from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, to St. Louis, to Denver, to the Colorado foothills stretched into an endless blur of cramped quarters, stale bread and the constant bone-rattling sway of wooden wheels over rutted roads that seemed designed to jar loose every tooth in a person's head. Laurel shared the coach with a rotating cast of fellow travelers, each one a story she would never know the ending of. A miner heading back to the Colorado goldfields, his clothes still carrying the faint metallic smell of the underground. A circuit preacher with breath that smelled of whiskey and hands that gestured constantly as he quoted scripture to anyone who would listen and several who would not. A widow with two small children who cried ceaselessly, their thin voices rising and falling like a tide of misery that made Laurel's heart ache for them and for herself. The driver was a man named Henry Fletcher. Weathered and silent, he sat on the box like a statue carved from old wood, speaking perhaps 20 words during the entire 6-day journey. His face had the texture of leather that had been left in the sun for decades, creased into permanent squint lines by wind and weather and the relentless brightness of open roads. He drove with the steady competence of a man who had made this run 100 times before and expected to make it 100 times more. Laurel read the advertisement so many times the paper grew soft and feathered at the folds. She tried to imagine the man who had written it, a widower probably, struggling to raise 3 daughters alone in the wilderness. She pictured someone gentle with kind eyes and calloused hands, someone patient and grateful for help, someone who would treat her as a partner rather than a possession, someone nothing at all like Aldrich Whitfield and his wet, grasping fingers. The landscape changed as they traveled west each day, revealing a new version of the country. The gentle, civilized hills of Pennsylvania gave way to the flat, endless expanse of the Great Plains, where the horizon stretched so far in every direction that Laurel felt as if she were standing on the palm of God's hand. Then slowly, gradually, the land began to rise again. Folds appeared in the earth, then ridges, then the first hint of what was coming. By the time they reached Denver, the Rocky Mountains dominated the western horizon like a wall built by giants. Stone and ice, an impossible scale rising so high they seemed to hold up the sky itself. Laurel stared at them through the coach window and felt something shift inside her chest. Fear and wonder existing in the same breath. The mountains did not care about Philadelphia or Cordelia or Aldrich Whitfield. The mountains did not care about propriety or social standing or the expectations placed on young women of good family. The mountains simply were ancient and indifferent and overwhelmingly, terrifyingly beautiful. From Denver, the road grew rougher. They climbed into the foothills through forests of pine and aspen, the air growing thinner and colder with each mile. Snow appeared first on the highest peaks, a white crown against steel-gray sky, then lower dusting the slopes and patches, then finally covering the road itself, crunching under the wheels and muffling the horses' hooves into soft rhythmic thuds. The world narrowed. The broad expanses of the plains contracted into tight mountain valleys, where sunlight reached the bottom for only a few hours each day. Pine forests closed in on both sides of the road, dark and primeval, filled with shadows that seemed to move and breathe in the corners of Laurel's vision. On the afternoon of the 6th day, November 10th, Henry Fletcher called back through the coach window in his flat, economical voice. 10 miles to Copper Bend. We will make it before sunset if the weather holds. Laurel looked out at the landscape and felt her breath catch in her throat. They were on a narrow mountain road carved into the side of a cliff, a shelf of packed earth and gravel barely wide enough for the coach. To the left, sheer rock face rose straight up gray and streaked with ice, the stone scarred by centuries of freeze and thaw. To the right, the land fell away into nothing, a drop of 200 feet to a boulder-strewn ravine below, where a frozen stream glinted in the weak afternoon light like a vein of silver in the earth. A wooden railing ran along the outer edge of the road, old and weathered, its posts gray and cracked, leaning at angles that did not inspire confidence. It was the only barrier between the road and the void. Light snow had begun to fall, soft and steady, dusting everything with white. The temperature had dropped all afternoon, and now the cold was serious, the kind that turned breath into clouds and made fingers ache inside gloves. Laurel pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and watched her breath crystallize in the air. Just 10 more miles, then her new life would begin. Then she would be Laurel Prescott, teacher and bride, starting fresh in a place where no one knew her, shame or her name, or the desperate act of theft that had made this journey possible. That was when the horses began to act strangely. It started with the lead mare, a gray with a white blaze down her face. She tossed her head, suddenly snorting, pulling against the traces with a violence that made the entire coach shudder. Then the horse beside her joined in, stamping and whinnying earswaths flat against her skull. Within seconds, all four horses were agitated, tossing their heads, their eyes rolling to show the whites, their nostrils flaring at some invisible terror. Henry Fletcher's voice rose from the box, sharp with command. "Whoa there, easy now. Easy. Steady on." But the horses were beyond steadying. Something had spooked them, something Laurel could not see or smell or hear, but that terrified the animals with an ancient instinctive fear that no amount of human authority could override. Mountain lion, perhaps, or bear, or the particular scent of death that animals could detect from impossible distances. The led mare reared in her harness, forelegs pawing at the air, and the motion was like a match thrown into dry grass. Suddenly, all four horses were lunging forward, running panic made flesh and muscle and thundering hooves. The stagecoach lurched behind them like a toy dragged by a child, swinging wildly from side to side on the narrow mountain road. Henry hauled on the reins with both hands, his boots braced against the footboard, his entire body straining backward against the momentum of four terrified animals pulling 2 tons of wood and iron at full gallop along a road barely wide enough for walking. The coach swayed violently to the left, then the right, the wheels screaming against stone. Laurel was thrown against the sidewall, her head cracking against the window frame with a sound like a pistol shot. Stars exploded across her vision, white and sharp and blinding. She heard Henry shouting, his voice raw with desperate effort. She heard the scream of wood under stress joints, pulling apart bolts, straining against forces they were never built to withstand. She heard her own voice crying out, though she did not remember opening her mouth. The horses veered right, toward the edge, toward the railing, toward the 200-foot drop that waited on the other side of those rotten wooden posts like an open mouth. Time became something strange then. It stretched and compressed simultaneously so that Laurel experienced each fraction of a second as a separate eternity, while the whole catastrophe unfolded in less time than it takes to draw a breath. She saw the wooden railing rushing toward them, saw the gray posts that had stood for years through mountain weather and were now about to meet the irresistible force of 4 horses and a stagecoach traveling at full panic gallop. She saw Henry Fletcher's face twist with the last desperate effort of a man trying to turn the team, his leather gloves white with strain, the tendons in his neck standing out like cables. But momentum had them now. Physics had them. Gravity, patient and absolute, had them. The stagecoach hit the railing and it exploded into splinters. The sound was enormous, a crack like lightning striking a tree, followed by the shriek of wood tearing apart. Posts snapped like matchsticks. Rails disintegrated into showers of gray fragments that hung in the air for one frozen instant before falling into the void below. And then there was nothing between them and the emptiness. For one impossible crystalline moment, they hung suspended, all 4 wheels off the ground. The coach horizontal in space, floating, defying gravity for one final heartbeat before gravity reasserted its ancient, unbreakable authority. Laurel could see everything. The valley spread below like a painting rendered in whites and grays and the dark green of pine forests. Individual trees, rocks worn smooth by centuries of water. The frozen stream catching the last afternoon light, brilliant and sharp. Beautiful. It was so beautiful. Then they were falling. The world became chaos. Sky and ground traded places in a sickening spiral that Laurel's mind could not process. She saw Henry Fletcher's body fly past the coach window. Already limp, his arms outstretched, his face wearing the particular blankness of a man who has already left his body before impact. already gone. She saw her bag burst open, her belongings scattering into the air like seeds thrown by a careless hand. Dresses tumbling, the flash of white that was her undergarments. In the poetry book, the one with her fortune hidden in its hollowed pages spinning end over end through the cold air, pages fluttering, bills and coins floating free in a brief, absurd shower of money that no one would ever spend. Her mother's pearls caught the light for one instant, a string of pale fire against the gray sky, before they too vanished into the whirling destruction. The impact when it came was total. Sound and sensation merged into one overwhelming assault that erased thought and identity and everything except the pure animal experience of violence. Wood splintering in every direction, metal shrieking as iron fittings tore apart, her head slamming against something immovably hard, her ribs crushing against the edge of the seat, pain exploding through her entire body, bright and terrible, an absolute a white light that consumed everything. Then silence. Then a darkness that rose up from beneath her, like cold water filling a well. Then nothing at all. Consciousness returned in fragments, each piece arriving separately, as if her mind were a shattered mirror, slowly reassembling itself shard by shard. Cold. That was the first thing, bone-deep cold, that seeped through skin and muscle and settled into the marrow like something alive. The kind of cold that made thinking difficult because the brain itself seemed to slow each thought arriving wrapped in ice. Then pain, radiating from her head in waves that corresponded with her heartbeat, each pulse a fresh assault that made her stomach clench with nausea. Her ribs. Something wrong with her ribs. Each breath felt like knives sliding between the bones, sharp and precise and relentless. Then awareness. She was lying in snow. The wet cold seeping through her dress, through her chemise, through her skin, freezing against her back and legs and arms. She could feel individual snowflakes landing on her face, each one a tiny point of cold that melted immediately against her skin. Laurel opened her eyes to gray sky and falling snow. The world was white and gray and silent. And she was lying 20 feet from the overturned stagecoach, thrown clear somehow, in the violence of the crash, her body coming to rest against a cluster of rocks that had stopped her from rolling further down the slope. Blood ran hot down her right temple, a shocking warmth against her frozen skin. She could feel it moving, tracing a line from her hairline to her jaw, already beginning to freeze in her hair, turning the blonde strands dark and stiff. Every breath felt like being stabbed. Her ribs were damaged, cracked, or bruised, or possibly broken. Each inhalation a negotiation between the need for air and the body's furious protest against the pain of expanding her chest. She tried to sit up. The world spun the sky and ground trading places with a sickening lurch that brought bile rising in her throat. She fell back against the snow, gasping, waiting for the vertigo to pass while snowflakes landed on her upturned face with the gentle persistence of things that do not know they are falling on the dying. Around her, the mountainside was scattered with debris. Pieces of the stagecoach lay everywhere, some large enough to identify splintered planks and broken wheels and twisted iron, others reduced to fragments so small they might have been anything. Her belongings were strewn across the snow in a trail that marked the coach's tumbling path down the slope. A gray dress draped over a bush, like a ghost trying to hide. One boot standing upright in the snow as if someone invisible were wearing it. And Henry Fletcher's body, lying 30 feet away, face up his neck, bent at an angle that no living person could achieve. Snow was already gathering in the creases of his clothing, in the lines of his weathered face, in the open eyes that stared sightlessly at the gray sky with the particular emptiness that death brings. Dead. Definitely dead. Laurel had seen enough death to recognize its signature without question. Her parents broken and still in the wreckage of a train car. Her younger brother William taken by scarlet fever at age 7, his small body growing lighter and lighter in the bed as the disease consumed him from within. Death had familiar features. It wore a face she knew well. Now it wore Henry Fletcher's face, weathered and still snow gathering on his open eyes, like the world was trying to close them for him. The horses were gone. Their harnesses had broken in the fall leather and brass fittings, snapping under forces they were never designed to withstand, and they had fled into the mountains, terrified by the crash and the smell of blood. Laurel could hear nothing but wind moving through pine trees and her own ragged breathing, each inhale a small act of courage, each exhale a small victory over the pain. No voices, no hoofbeats, no rescue, nothing. She forced herself to assess the situation with the same rational mind that had earned her highest marks at Preston Academy. Observation first, then analysis, then action. The methodology her science instructor had drilled into her useful not just for academic exercises, but for the real and desperate business of staying alive. She was alone, injured, on a mountain road in Colorado territory with winter closing in fast and hard. The temperature was dropping as sunset approached the brief warmth of the afternoon, giving way to the killing cold of a mountain night. Her gray traveling dress was torn at the shoulder and soaked with blood and melting snow, the fabric clinging to her skin like wet paper, providing no insulation whatsoever. Hypothermia was not a question of if, but when. No one knew she was here. Aunt Cordelia thought her hiding somewhere in Philadelphia, perhaps in a boarding house, or at the home of a friend waiting to be found and returned to her duties. The ranch, expecting a mail-order bride, would not miss her for weeks, assuming they were even waiting at all. And even if they were, they would have no idea which road she was on or what had happened to the stage. Henry Fletcher was dead. The horses were gone. Her money was scattered across a mountainside, bills frozen into the snow, coins buried beneath debris. And Laurel Prescott was bleeding from her head and could not draw a full breath without feeling something grind inside her chest. This is how I die, she thought. And the thought arrived with a strange clarity, almost peaceful. Alone on a mountain. And alone like I have always been alone, even in rooms full of people. Even at dinner parties, in church services, in all the crowded, suffocating gatherings where everyone smiled and no one saw each other. But something in her refused to accept it. Some stubborn, irrational core that had survived the death of her parents, survived the loss of William, survived 3 years of Cordelia's cold tyranny, survived 6 months of Aldrich Whitfield's wet hands and gum-bearing smile. That core was small and fierce and absolutely unwilling to let her lie down in the snow and surrender. Not here. Not like this. Not after everything. Laurel got to her feet. The world tilted dangerously, the horizon swinging like the deck of a ship in heavy seas. She swayed, catching herself against a boulder, pressing her palms flat against the cold stone and waiting for her vision to stabilize. Blood dripped from her chin onto the snow, making small red flowers that bloomed and spread in the white. Her head throbbed with each heartbeat, a pounding rhythm that seemed to originate behind her right eye and radiate outward in waves. Her ribs screamed with every breath, a sharp, grinding protest that made her want to stop breathing entirely just to escape the pain. But she was standing. That was something. That was the beginning. She found her bag wedged in a scrub pine bush 10 feet from where she had landed, the leather scuffed and torn, but the clasp still holding. Most of her belongings were still inside. A spare dress, her teaching certificate slightly crumpled but intact. Not much to show for 24 years of life. The poetry book was gone, along with the $63 that had been her entire fortune. And her mother's pearl necklace, the one thing she owned that could not be replaced, was somewhere on this mountainside, buried under snow and wreckage, lost as completely as the woman who had given it to her. Laurel stood for a moment with the bag in her hands, feeling the weight of everything she had lost settle on her shoulders like a physical burden. Money, pearls, poetry, the accumulated evidence of a life now scattered across a mountain like the debris of a ship that had broken apart on rocks. Then she picked up the bag and started walking. Up the road, because down led to the ravine and the wreckage and Henry Fletcher's empty eyes. Up because somewhere in the mountains ahead was a ranch called Kestrel Peak and a life she had traveled 1,000 miles to find. Up because the alternative was death, and Margaret Laurel Prescott had not stolen money and fled across a continent and survived a 200-foot fall just to die on a mountainside before even reaching her destination. One foot in front of the other. That was all she could manage, not thinking about the miles ahead or the cold deepening around her or the blood still running warm and steady from the brain in her head. Just one step, then another, then another. The simplest and hardest thing in the world. Rain began to fall. Not the clean rain of Philadelphia spring, but a sleeting, half-frozen assault that came sideways out of the mountains, driven by a wind that cut through her wet clothes like they were not there at all. Each drop hit her skin like a tiny needle, cold and sharp, adding its small cruelty to the catalog of miseries that her body was already enduring. Blood ran into her right eye and she wiped it away with her sleeve, leaving dark smears on gray fabric. She had bound the head wound with her handkerchief, pressing the folded cloth against the gash and holding it there with one shaking hand, but the handkerchief was already soaked through heavy with blood, useless as a bandage. The wound was still bleeding. Not fast enough to kill her quickly, but fast enough to weaken her, draining her reserves drop by drop. Time lost meaning. She might have walked for an hour, might have been 2, might have been 10 minutes. The mountain road stretched endlessly ahead, narrow and treacherous, climbing higher into mountains that seemed to have no summit, no peak, no point where the ascent ended and something level and merciful began. The rain fell harder. The light failed. The cold deepened until Laurel could no longer feel her feet or her hands or the tip of her nose. Her vision swam. Colors bled into each other. The gray of the road and the white of the snow and the dark green of the pines all merged into a single smeared impression of a world that was giving up on being real. She stumbled, her numb foot catching on a rock, and went down hard on her knees in the mud. The handkerchief fell away from her head, wound dropping into the mud beside her like a small red surrender flag. Fresh blood flowed immediately hot against her frozen skin, tracing new paths down her face and neck. Laurel tried to stand. Her legs would not cooperate. The muscles trembled and burned and simply refused to lift her weight. She knelt in the road, her dress heavy with water and mud, her hair plastered to her face, her entire body shaking with cold and blood loss, and the exhaustion of someone who has been running for 6 days and fighting for her life for the last several hours. For the first time since the crash, she felt tears burn her eyes, hot and sharp and humiliating. Not from the pain, though the pain was considerable. Not from fear, though she was terrified in a way that went beyond physical danger to something existential. The fear of disappearing without a trace of dying unnamed and unmourned on a mountain that did not even know she existed. The tears came from the crushing weight of it all, the years of trying to be good enough, proper enough, acceptable enough, the endless, exhausting effort to fit herself into shapes that were never meant to hold her. Dutiful niece, grateful ward, willing bride. Each identity a costume she wore over the real person underneath the person who read poetry in the dark and dreamed of mountains and refused in some deep and private part of herself to believe that this was all life could offer. And now dying alone on a mountain because she had dared to want something different. Because she had been brave enough, or foolish enough, or desperate enough to steal money from her aunt and flee across a continent, chasing an advertisement in a newspaper that promised a life she had never dared imagine for herself. The irony was exquisite and terrible, and almost funny in the way that only the worst things are funny. Then she heard it. Hoofbeats. Laurel's head snapped up, hope surging through her exhausted body like lightning through a dead wire. The sensation was almost painful, the sudden revival of a hope she had already begun to bury. Someone was coming. Someone was on this road, in this rain, in this dying light. She tried to stand, failed, fell back to her knees, tried again, and managed to get one foot under her before her balance gave way, and she went sideways, catching herself with one palm in the mud. She knelt there in the road, shaking her face tilted toward the sound, her blood smeared, hand raised in a gesture that was half wave and half prayer. The horse and rider emerged from the rain like something from a fever dream. Shapes coalescing out of gray and white edges, blurred by precipitation and fading light, becoming solid through what felt like pure force of will. As if the mountain had looked at her kneeling in the mud and decided reluctantly to offer one final chance. The man was enormous. Even sitting on his massive black stallion, even viewed through rain-blurred eyes from her position on the ground, Laurel could tell he was easily 6.5 feet tall. Broad in the shoulders and thick through the chest, built like a man whose body had been forged by years of physical labor in a landscape that did not forgive weakness. Dark hair plastered to his head by rain. A thick beard covering the lower half of his face, dark and full, giving him the look of something elemental, a creature of the mountains, rather than a man who merely lived in them. His eyes were the color of winter storms. Gray and cold and intense, the kind of eyes that saw everything and revealed nothing. They swept over her with a clinical efficiency that took in every detail. The blood, the torn dress, the shaking hands, the white face and the desperate eyes, all of it cataloged and assessed in the space of a single heartbeat. A scar ran from his right temple down to his dome, a pale line against sun-darkened skin. Old and healed but permanent, the kind of mark that told a story he would probably never share with anyone. He wore rough work clothes that looked like they had been chosen for durability rather than appearance. A long coat nearly black with water hung past his knees. Heavy boots, leather gloves dark with rain. He sat his horse with the kind of easy, unconscious confidence that spoke of years in the saddle, his body moving with the animal's gait as naturally as breathing. Not a man from Laurel's world. Not from the world of parlors and tea parties and embroidered cushions and conversations conducted in careful measured tones about nothing of importance. This was something else entirely. Something raw and real and dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with violence, and everything to do with the fundamental difference between men who lived inside the rules and men who lived outside them. The rider dismounted in one fluid motion that belied his size, swinging down from the tall horse and moving toward Laurel with a grace that seemed impossible for someone built like a stone wall. His boots made no sound in the mud. His approach was steady and purposeful, the way a man moves when he knows exactly what he is doing and wastes no energy on hesitation. Laurel tried to speak, tried to explain about the stagecoach and the horses and Henry Fletcher lying dead a mile down the mountain. Tried to say her name, her destination, the story of how she came to be kneeling in the mud on a mountain road in the fading light of a November afternoon. But her voice came out barely above a whisper, words dissolving into gasping breaths, each attempt at speech consuming energy she no longer possessed. She heard herself making sounds that were not quite language fragments and syllables that broke apart before they could form meaning. The man's gray eyes swept over her again, lingering on the blood streaming down her face, the way she cradled her left side where her ribs burned, with each breath her shaking hands that could not grip anything anymore, not even hope. He did not speak, did not ask questions or demand explanations, or offer the kind of reassuring words that civilized people use to fill uncomfortable silences. He simply bent and scooped her up in his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. One motion, effortless, like lifting a child. Laurel should have protested. Every fiber of her proper Philadelphia upbringing demanded that she protest. A strange man picking her up without permission, without introduction, without any of the social protocols that governed interactions between men and women in the civilized world. She should demand he put her down. She should insist on walking. She should, at the very minimum, ask his name before allowing him to hold her body against his. But she was so cold, so tired, and his body was impossibly warm. Solid as a wall of heated stone, dense and unyielding, and radiating heat through the wet fabric of his clothes in a way that made her want to press closer to burrow into that warmth and never surface. His arms were like iron bands around her, holding her secure against his chest, with a certainty that left no room for doubt. She could feel the strength in him, not just physical strength, but something deeper, a solidity of being that felt like bedrock, like something you could build on, something that would hold. Laurel let her head fall against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart through the wet cotton of his shirt, strong and sure and alive, the most reassuring sound she had ever heard. He settled her on his horse, mounting behind her in one smooth movement that barely disturbed the animal. One arm wrapped around her waist, holding her upright against his chest. The other hand took the reins, and they were moving the stallion, picking its way up the mountain road with careful, steady steps, each hoof placed deliberately on the treacherous surface. Safe, Laurel thought, as consciousness began to slip away again, the edges of the world growing soft and indistinct. For now, for this moment, safe. Not forever, not permanently, not in any way that she could count on or predict. But right now, held against the chest of a stranger whose name she did not know, on a horse, climbing through rain and gathering darkness toward a destination she could only hope existed. Laurel Prescott felt safer than she had felt in 3 years, since before her parents died, since before the world became a place of vultures and cages and wet hands reaching for her under tables. She drifted, then consciousness ebbing and flowing like a tide. Sometimes she was aware of the horse's movement beneath her, the rhythmic sway that would have been soothing if every step did not send fresh pain rippling through her damaged ribs. Sometimes she heard the rain hammering against leather and flesh, and the steady breathing of the man who held her. Sometimes she felt his arm tighten around her waist when the trail grew steeper, holding her secure against his body with an authority that felt less like possession and more like protection. Once, in a moment of clarity, She opened her eyes and saw mountains all around her, dark shapes against a sky that was neither day nor night, but something in between. Snow on the peaks, pine forests like black walls on either side, and the road climbing, always climbing, as if it were trying to reach the clouds. Then the darkness took her, again warm and absolute, and she let it. When Laurel woke fully, she was no longer on the horse. She was lying on something soft. A bed. A real bed with rough wool blankets and feather pillows that smelled of cedar and wood smoke, and something clean and masculine that she could not identify. There were voices around her, deep male voices rumbling in the darkness like distant thunder rolling through mountain valleys, speaking quietly but with an intensity that cut through the fog of her half-consciousness like blades. "Where did you find her?" The voice was rough but controlled, each word measured and precise. "In the road. 3 miles down the pass, stagecoach went over the edge near Widow's Point. Driver is dead." A different voice. Deeper, the one she recognized, though she did not know how she recognized it. The man who had carried her. The man with the winter gray eyes and the scar running down his jaw. She the only survivor. Looks like it. A pause. The crackle of fire. The sound of something liquid being poured. She is hurt. Head wounds still bleeding some. Ribs are damaged, maybe cracked, maybe bruised. Hard to tell without looking closer. We need to get her warm and dry before we worry about the rest. She is half frozen. Another hour out there, and we would be bearing her alongside the driver. Laurel forced her eyes open. The effort felt enormous, like lifting weights with muscles that had forgotten how to work. Light hit her retinas, and she winced, then adjusted the room, coming into focus in stages. She was in a large room with rough-hewn wooden walls, the kind built from logs that still bore the marks of the axe that had shaped them. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, built from river rock, fitted together with the precision of a mason who took pride in his craft. Flames roared in the hearth, orange and gold, throwing dancing shadows across the ceiling and filling the room with a heat that felt glorious, almost holy after the hours of freezing rain. 3 men stood near the bed, all of them watching her with expressions she could not quite read. The one who had rescued her stood closest still, dripping rainwater onto the wooden floor, a puddle forming around his boots. In the firelight, his features were even more striking than they had been in the rain. Strong, angular, dominated by those ice-gray eyes, and the scar that ran from temple to jaw, like a roadmap of violence, survived. His dark hair hung wet around his face, and his beard, thick and black, gave him the look of something biblical. A prophet or a warrior or some combination of both that the modern world had no category for. Beside him stood another man, slightly less tall, but just as powerfully built. Same dark hair, but clean-shaven, revealing a strong jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same stone as the fireplace, and a mouth that looked like it rarely smiled. Hazel eyes studied her with quiet intensity, the kind of scrutiny that felt like being examined under a magnifying glass. There was something guarded in those eyes, something that had been hurt and had learned to hide the wound behind a wall of caution. The third man stood slightly apart from the others, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. Blonde, where the other two were dark, with gentler features that somehow managed to be no less imposing. Tall and broad-shouldered, with hands that looked like they could crush stones or cradle eggs with equal facility. Green eyes held something that might have been concern or calculation, or both, the intelligence behind them sharp and watchful. All 3 wore rough work clothes stained with mud and the smell of animals. Flannel and denim and leather, the uniform of men who worked with their hands and their bodies in a landscape that demanded everything and forgave nothing. All 3 were large in the way that mountains are large, not just tall, but present, occupying space with an authority that made the substantial room feel smaller. And all 3 looked at her with the particular intensity of men who had not been in the company of a woman for a very long time. Not predatory exactly, but aware, deeply, unmistakably aware. Laurel tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Pain lanced through her head, her ribs, her left shoulder, a 3-part harmony of agony that made her gasp and fall back against the pillows with her visions swimming. Easy. The dark-haired man who had rescued her moved closer, his large hand pressing gently but firmly on her shoulder. "You took a hard fall. Do not try to move yet." His voice was deep, rough around the edges, like stones tumbling in a fast-moving river. The kind of voice that expected to be obeyed. Not from cruelty, but from authority, the natural command of someone accustomed to making decisions and having them followed. Laurel found herself going still under his touch, though, whether from pain or from the strange calm that his presence seemed to impose on the air around him, she could not say. "Who are you?" Her own voice came out thin and reedy, barely recognizable even to herself. It was the voice of someone who had been screaming, though she could not remember when. The three men exchanged glances. Some silent communication passed between them, quick as lightning, a language of shared history and mutual understanding that required no words. Then the one with his hand on her shoulder spoke. "I am Rowan Callister. This is my brother Judson." He gestured to the clean-shaven man with the hazel eyes. "We call him Jude, and that is Phelan Brooks. We own Kestrel Peak Ranch." The words hit Laurel with the force of a physical blow. Kestrel Peak Ranch, the place she had been traveling to, the mail-order bride position, the three young daughters who needed education and mothering. Her heart stuttered in her chest, hope and relief flooding through her so fast it made her dizzy. She had made it. Against all odds, through crash and blood and freezing rain, she had arrived at her destination. But there are supposed to be children, she managed. Little girls who need a mother and a teacher. The room went very still. The fire crackled. Wind pressed against the windows. And the three men's expressions shifted in unison. Something dark and complicated passing between them like a shadow crossing the sun. Rowan Callister's ice-gray eyes held hers without flinching. His hand remained on her shoulder, steady and warm. "There are no children," he said quietly. "There never were." The words fell into the silence like stones dropped into deep water, sending ripples outward in every direction. Laurel stared at him, her exhausted mind struggling to process what he was saying. If there were no children, then the advertisement was false. The position she had traveled 1,000 miles to fill did not exist. The life she had risked everything to reach was a fiction. "I do not understand," she whispered. Jude spoke, then his voice rougher than his brother's, carrying an edge that might have been anger or might have been old pain resurfacing at an inconvenient moment. "We did not place the advertisement. Our former housekeeper did it before we fired her for stealing. Nettie Marsh. She placed fake advertisements in newspapers across the East as a revenge for losing her position." He paused, his jaw tightening the muscle there, jumping as he clenched his teeth against something he did not want to say, but was going to say anyway. "I know what it is like to be deceived by a woman. My fiancée, Odette, left me standing at the altar 5 years ago. Walked out of the church and straight to a banker from Denver who had more money and fewer calluses. Took half my savings with her, too. So when Nettie placed those advertisements using our ranch, our name, it felt like history repeating. Another woman's lies causing us trouble." The words hit Laurel like physical blows, each one landing in a different place, each one doing its own particular damage. No position, no job, no children who needed a teacher, no widower who needed a wife. Nothing but a vindictive woman's revenge against men Laurel had never met, using a newspaper advertisement as her weapon and Laurel's desperation as ammunition. "Then I came all this way for nothing." Her voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. "A shell with the contents removed. The position does not exist. I have no job, no money to return east, no way to survive." The silence that followed was thick enough to touch. The fire popped and hissed. Outside, the wind moaned against the walls like something grieving. The three men stood around her bed, all of them watching her with that same unreadable intensity, and Laurel felt the full weight of her situation settle on her chest like a stone. She was alone, injured, broke, 1,000 miles from the nearest person who knew her name, and that person was an aunt who wanted to chain her to a man whose touch made her physically ill. She had burned every bridge, spent every cent, and traveled to the edge of the civilized world for a position that had never existed. This is the moment, she thought. This is when the story ends. Not with a crash or a gunshot, but with the quiet, devastating realization that there is nowhere left to go. Then Phelan spoke. His voice was gentler than the others, carrying a warmth that the other two men kept carefully hidden. He pushed off from the doorframe and moved into the room, his green eyes holding Laurel's, with a steadiness that felt like an anchor. "The position could exist," he said simply, "if you are willing to stay. We do need help managing the household. The place has gone to pieces since we fired Nettie. Three men living alone tend to let things slide in ways that would horrify any woman with sense. Laurel almost laughed. It came out as a sound that was halfway between laughter and a sob, broken and brittle and tasting of blood from her split lip. I am trained as a governess and teacher, not as a housekeeper for three bachelors in the middle of nowhere. Rowan's ice-gray eyes held hers, and in them she saw something she had not expected. Not pity, not charity. Something closer to recognition, as if he saw in her a version of something he understood. "You are also a woman with no other options," he said, and his voice was not cruel, but it was honest in a way that cruelty sometimes pretended to be. "Injured on our mountain with nowhere else to go. We are offering you a position, room and board and fair wage and safety. The alternative is we give you money for a stage ticket back east once you are healed and you return to whatever you were running from." The word running landed with precision. He knew. Without being told, without knowing the specifics, Rowan Callister had looked at her and seen a woman in flight. The gray dress, the false name, the fact that she had traveled 1,000 miles alone to answer an advertisement for a mail-order bride in the wilderness. All of it pointed in one direction. Laurel closed her eyes. Behind her lids, she saw Philadelphia. Cordelia's parlor with its suffocating propriety. Aldrich Whitfield's wet hands. The wedding dress hanging in her wardrobe like a shroud. A lifetime of being looked at and never seen. Of being spoken to and never heard. Of being held and never touched. She had taken the mail-order bride position to escape all of that. To find independence in the territories where a woman's past mattered less than her willingness to work. Where strength was valued more than lineage, and competence meant more than compliance. And now three mountain men she had never met were offering her the same thing. Not what she had expected, not what she had planned, but perhaps in the way that unexpected things so often were exactly what she needed. "I will stay," she heard herself say. "At least until spring when the pass is clear. By then I will have earned enough to make my own way somewhere else." Something flickered across Rowan's face. Too brief to identify with certainty. Satisfaction, perhaps? Or relief? Or something that lived in the complicated space between those two things. "Good," he said. "Now lie still while I clean that wound. You may have a concussion." Laurel wanted to protest that it was improper for a man to tend her injuries, that the rules of civilized behavior demanded a female chaperone at minimum, that everything about this situation violated every standard of conduct she had been raised to uphold. But exhaustion dragged at her like weights attached to every limb, pulling her toward the darkness that hovered at the edges of her consciousness. She lay still as Rowan Callister's surprisingly gentle hands cleaned the gash on her forehead, his scarred fingers moving across her skin with the practiced precision of someone who had tended wounds before many times on animals, and probably on people. Jude brought water and clean cloth without being asked, anticipating his brother's needs with the wordless efficiency of long partnership. Phelan added wood to the fire, adjusting the logs with hands that seemed to know exactly where each piece needed to go, building the heat higher, driving back the cold that had nearly killed the woman lying in their spare bed. They moved around her with a coordination that was almost beautiful in its efficiency. Three men who knew each other so deeply, so thoroughly that they functioned as a single organism. Each one anticipating, each one responding, each one filling the gaps the others left with seamless, unconscious precision. When Rowan finished bandaging her head, wrapping clean cloth firmly around the wound with hands that were gentle but allowed no argument, he sat back on his heels and looked at her with those winter eyes. "You will need to rest for a few days. That was a hard hit, and you have lost blood. We will bring you food and water and check on you regularly. This room is just off the kitchen. The privy is out back, but there is a chamber pot under the bed if you cannot make it that far." "Thank you," Laurel whispered, "for saving me, for not leaving me out there to die." Rowan's expression did not change, but something moved in those gray eyes deep beneath the surface. Something that might have been warmth or might have been warning. "We are not monsters, Miss Prescott," he said. "We are just men trying to survive on this mountain." Then the three of them left, closing the door softly behind them. Laurel lay in the warm bed, listening to their voices fade as they moved deeper into the house. The rumble of low conversation, indistinct through the log walls but comforting in its presence. Evidence of life. Evidence that she was not alone. She should be terrified. She knew this. She was alone in the wilderness with three strange men, each one large enough to overpower her without effort. The job she had traveled for did not exist. She had nearly died today and was lying in a stranger's bed with a bandage on her head, impossibly broken ribs, and no money, and no way home. But all she felt lying there in the warmth of a fire built by hands that had handled her with unexpected gentleness was a strange anticipation. A sense that her life was about to change in ways she could not predict or control. The governess who had left Philadelphia was already gone, left behind on that mountain road with the overturned stagecoach and Henry Fletcher's sightless eyes. In her place was someone she did not yet know. Someone who would have to be harder, stronger, more adaptable than any version of herself that had existed before. Someone who could survive in a place where the rules she had been raised by did not apply. Laurel slept, and the sleep was deep and dreamless, the kind of unconsciousness that the body demands when it has been pushed to the absolute limit of endurance and can go no further. Outside, the rain turned to snow. Inside, the fire burned low and steady, and somewhere in the house, three men who had been alone for far too long sat in silence and contemplated the woman who had crashed into their lives as literally and as violently as the stagecoach had crashed into the ravine below Widow's Point. None of them slept that night, and none of them spoke about why. When Laurel woke the next morning, sunlight was streaming through the window in long golden shafts that caught the dust motes and made them glow like tiny stars suspended in amber. For a moment, she did not know where she was. The ceiling was wrong. Too high, too rough, made of hand-hewn beams instead of the smooth plaster she was accustomed to. The smell was wrong, too. Cedar and wood smoke and the faint, pleasant scent of pine resin instead of Cordelia's suffocating lilies. Then memory arrived like a fist. The stagecoach, the fall, Henry Fletcher's broken neck, the mountain man with ice-gray eyes who had lifted her from the mud as if she weighed nothing at all. Laurel turned her head carefully on the pillow, testing the pain. It was there, a deep, persistent throb behind her right eye, but manageable now, reduced overnight from something blinding to something merely miserable. Progress of a sort. Someone had been in the room while she slept. On the rough wooden table beside the bed sat a tin plate with fresh bread, thick slices of cold venison, and a wedge of hard cheese. Beside it, a cup of coffee that was still warm, steam rising in a thin thread that caught the sunlight and disappeared. The bread had been sliced carefully, the meat arranged with a kind of clumsy attention that suggested someone who was not accustomed to preparing food for others, but who had tried. Laurel sat up slowly, every movement a negotiation with her damaged body. Her ribs protested with that same grinding knife-edge pain, but it was duller now, the sharpest edges worn down by sleep and warmth, and the simple miracle of having survived the night. She ate, grateful for the solid food, feeling strength seep back into her limbs with each bite. While she ate, she took stock of her situation with the methodical precision that had made her the top student at Preston Academy. Her bag had been brought in while she slept and placed on a chair near the door. Someone had dried her clothes and hung them near the fire, the gray fabric stiff and slightly misshapen from the heat but clean. Her small collection of belongings was intact. 3 dresses, all severe and all the color of overcast skies. Undergarments folded with a care that made her face warm when she thought about whose hands had handled them. A pair of boots scuffed but serviceable. Her teaching certificates from Preston Academy, slightly water-stained but legible. 2 books she had packed, a grammar text and a volume of Shakespeare's histories. Not much to show for 24 years of life. A woman's entire existence reduced to what could fit in a leather bag small enough to carry in one hand. The poetry book was gone. The money was gone. Her mother's pearls were gone, lying somewhere on a mountainside under snow that would not melt until spring. And by then the leather cord would have rotted and the pearls would have scattered into the earth like seeds that would never grow. Laurel pushed that thought away. Grief was a luxury she could not afford right now. Later, she would mourn the pearls and what they represented. Later, she would let herself feel the full weight of losing the last physical connection to her mother. But now she needed to be practical. Ruthlessly, relentlessly practical. She rose and dressed carefully, choosing the least damaged of her gray dresses and pulling it on with movements that were slow and deliberate, each one calculated to minimize the pain in her ribs. Her fingers worked the buttons with mechanical efficiency despite their trembling. She brushed her hair as best she could with her fingers, pulling it back from her face and twisting it into a simple knot at the base of her neck. The bandage on her forehead was white and stark against her blonde hair. Her reflection in the small mirror hanging on the wall showed a face she barely recognized, pale as paper beneath dark circles that looked like bruises, lips cracked and colorless, eyes too large in a face that had grown thin from 6 days of stale bread and bad sleep. The bandage gave her the look of a wounded soldier, which she supposed was not entirely inaccurate. She looked like she had been in a war. Perhaps she had been. Perhaps she had been fighting one for years without knowing it. And perhaps the crash on the mountain was not the beginning of the battle, but the moment she finally stopped retreating. The house was quiet when she emerged from her room, stepping through the doorway into the large kitchen she had glimpsed only in fragments the night before. Now in the clear morning light, she could see it properly for the first time. It was a room built for function rather than beauty, but it had achieved a kind of beauty anyway, the way that all things made with care and purpose eventually do. A massive black iron stove dominated one wall, its surface still warm from the morning fire, a thin plume of heat rising from its chimney pipe. Shelves lined the walls, holding dishes and jars and supplies in somewhat haphazard order. Flour next to axle grease, sugar beside shotgun shells. The domestic and the practical jumbled together in a way that would have made Cordelia Pembroke faint dead away. A large wooden table occupied the center of the room, its surface scarred from years of use, knife marks and burn rings, and the circular stains of 1,000 cups of coffee. But it was solid and clean, the wood worn smooth by countless hands, and it had the feel of a place where important things happened. Decisions made, meals shared, the daily rituals of survival enacted over and over until they became a kind of prayer. Beyond the kitchen stretched the main room, and when Laurel stepped into it, the view through the windows stopped her in her tracks. The valley spread below the ranch like something painted by a master who had used up all the colors and started over with new ones. Mountains rose on all sides, their peaks still wearing crowns of white snow that blazed in the morning sun. The slopes were covered in pine forests so dark they appeared almost black, broken here and there by meadows that would be green in summer but were now brown and gold with the last grass of autumn. Far below, a river wound through the valley floor, catching the light and throwing it back in fragments of silver. The ranch itself spread across a gentle plateau partway up the mountain. Laurel could see buildings and corrals and the barn where she had heard voices the night before. Cattle dotted the lower meadows, dark shapes moving slowly through the frost. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals with motionless wings, was patient and watchful. It was wild. It was harsh. It was strangely magnificent. A place where civilization's careful boundaries blurred and dissolved, and something older took their place. A place where a woman might be able to breathe without asking permission first. "You are up." Laurel spun toward the voice, wincing as the sudden movement sent pain lancing through her ribs. Phelan stood in the doorway that led to the outside, his blonde hair catching the morning light like wheat in a field. He was even larger than she had realized since the night before the firelight, having been deceptive in its shadows. His shoulders were nearly as wide as the doorframe he stood in, and he had to duck slightly to pass through it, a gesture so practiced it appeared unconscious. But his expression was gentle. Those green eyes held a warmth that softened his imposing size, made him seem approachable in a way that neither Rowan nor Jude had managed. He looked at her with what appeared to be genuine concern, his gaze moving briefly to the bandage on her forehead before returning to her eyes. "How is your head?" he asked. "Throbbing," Laurel admitted, "but I have survived worse." Something in Phelan's expression suggested he doubted the accuracy of that claim, but was too polite to say so. He moved into the kitchen with a familiarity that spoke of years in this room, his hands reaching for the coffee pot and clean cups, without looking the way a person moves through a space they know as well as their own body. "Rowan said you were educated," he said, measuring coffee grounds into the pot with the same careful attention he might give to measuring gunpowder. "A governess." "Yes." Laurel lowered herself into a chair at the large table, watching him work. She was grateful for the conversation, for the normalcy of it. Two people talking in a kitchen in the morning light while coffee brewed. It felt almost civilized, almost safe. "I studied at Preston Academy in Philadelphia. 2 years of advanced instruction, literature, languages, mathematics, music. Everything a young lady of quality should know, and everything a governess should be able to teach." "That must have been expensive." Phelan observed his back to her as he worked. "My parents sacrificed a great deal for it." Laurel's voice went quiet, falling into the register that grief always seemed to demand. Low and controlled, as if speaking too loudly about the dead might disturb them. They wanted me to have opportunities they never had. My father was a clerk. My mother gave music lessons. Neither of them had the education they dreamed of for me. They saved for years to send me to Preston. She paused, watching the steam arise from the pot. They died before they could see what their investment bought me. Phelan turned, then sliding a cup of coffee across the table to her, with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the size of his hands. The cup was tin-dented and stained with years of use, but the coffee inside was hot and strong and smelled like the best thing in the world. "I am sorry," he said. And the words were simple, but they carried weight. Not the hollow sympathy of people who say they are sorry because social convention demands it. Something realer than that. Something that had been earned through personal experience with the particular devastation of loss. "Death is hard," he continued, sitting across from her at the scarred table. "We have lost people too. Our parents both years ago. Rowan lost a wife and daughter to fever. Marin and Elise. The fever took them in 3 days, and Rowan was out hunting when it happened. Came home to find them already buried. The neighbors had not known how to reach him in time." Phelan's green eyes went distant for a moment, looking at something that was not in the room. Something that lived in the past and would never fully leave. "Left just the three of us to make sense of what remained," he said. "Rowan, Jude, and me. We are not brothers by blood. Jude and Rowan are. I grew up on the neighboring farm back in Virginia. But when everything fell apart, when death and betrayal took everything we thought was solid, we came west together. Built this place from nothing. Made ourselves into something that could survive." Laurel looked at him with new understanding. The gentle green eyes, the warmth he carried like a lantern in a dark room. This was a man who had walked through his own kind of fire and come out the other side, not hardened, but deepened. Not made cruel by loss, but made more careful with the things that remained. "So you know what it is like," she said quietly, "to have everything torn away, to have to rebuild from nothing." Phelan's smile was sad, the expression of a man who had made peace with sadness long ago, who carried it not as a wound, but as a companion. "That is exactly what we know. That is why we came west, to build something that could not be taken away by death or circumstance, or the cruelty of people who were supposed to love us, to make ourselves strong enough to survive anything." "And have you," Laurel asked, "become strong enough?" Phelan's expression shifted, the sadness deepening into something more complex. "Ask me that again when you have been here longer," he said, "when you have seen what this mountain makes of people." Before Laurel could respond, the door opened again, bringing with it a rush of cold air and the scent of animals and hay, and the particular freshness of a mountain morning that had been washed clean by last night's rain. Rowan Callister entered the room, and his presence filled it like water filling a vessel, flowing into every corner, occupying every inch of available space. He was dressed for work, his clothes practical, and stained, his dark hair still damp from the cold. Those ice-gray eyes found Laurel immediately the way a compass needle finds north, and swept over her with the same clinical assessment he had given her the night before. Checking, cataloging, determining whether she was better or worse or the same. "You should still be resting," he said. "I am not an invalid," Laurel replied, lifting her chin. "The wound is healing, and I cannot lie in bed while there is work to be done." Rowan moved closer, and Laurel felt that strange awareness again, the same sensation she had felt the night before when he carried her through the rain. Not fear exactly, something adjacent to fear, but fundamentally different. A heightened consciousness of his physical presence, of the space he occupied, in the air he displaced, in the way gravity itself seemed to bend around him. His hand reached for her bandage, and she held very still as his fingers, scarred and rough from years of work, with rope and leather and the hard edges of mountain living, touched the cloth with surprising delicacy. He unwrapped it slowly, peeling back the layers to examine the wound beneath. Laurel focused on the wall behind him and tried not to think about how close he stood, how she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, how his breath stirred the loose hair at her temple. "It is healing," he said after a moment, and rewrapping the bandage with quick, efficient movements. "You got lucky. Another inch to the left, and the stage driver would not have been the only casualty." "I know," Laurel said. The words felt inadequate. What did you say to the man who had pulled you from the mud and carried you through the rain and dressed your wounds with hands that could break you as easily as mend you? Thank you did not seem sufficient. Nothing seemed sufficient. Rowan stepped back, putting distance between them, and the air in the room seemed to ease slightly, as if a pressure she had not been consciously aware of had been released. His expression was unreadable, a fortress of stone and ice that revealed nothing of what lay beneath. Jude is checking the road, he said. If the stage company has not sent anyone yet, we will ride down and report the accident ourselves. They will need to recover the driver's body before the animals get to it. The casual reference to animals feeding on Henry Fletcher's corpse was jarring, a reminder that she was no longer in a world where death was discussed in euphemisms and hushed tones. Here, death was a fact common and unremarkable, handled with the same practical efficiency as any other chore. "And my position," Laurel asked, keeping her voice steady, "the one that does not exist. That is something we should discuss," Rowan said. "All of us together. Which is why I waited for you to arrive," Phelan said from his seat at the table. "We need to be clear about expectations, about what we are offering and what we are asking in return." The front door opened again, and the third member of the household entered, bringing with him the smell of mud and cold and horse. Jude Callister's boots were caked with the thick brown clay of the ranch yard, and his hazel eyes were hard as he surveyed the room, taking in Laurel at the table, Phelan with his coffee, Rowan standing with his arms crossed. "The road is clear," he reported, directing his words at Rowan with the deference of a younger brother accustomed to reporting to an older one. "I can ride down this afternoon to report the accident." Then he turned to Laurel, and the hardness in his eyes intensified. Not hostility exactly, but something close to it. Wariness, the look of a man who had been burned and was determined never to let fire get that close again. "Unless you want to come with me," he said. "Go back to civilization while you still can." "Why would I do that?" Laurel asked. "You offered me a position." Jude's eyes narrowed. "We offered temporary shelter. There is a difference, Jude." Rowan's voice carried a warning, low and quiet but unmistakable. The kind of warning that brothers exchanged in the shorthand of shared history. A single word that contained an entire conversation. "We discussed this," Jude shot back, turning on her brother with a flash of the anger that seemed to live just beneath his surface at all times. "And I said it was a bad idea then, and I still think so now. A woman living here with 3 men. Do I need to spell out why that is a disaster waiting to happen? But apparently my opinion does not count because I am outvoted. Fine. But if we are going to do this, let us at least be honest with her about what she is agreeing to. If you stay, you will be the only woman for 30 miles in any direction. You will be cooking for 3 men who eat like draft horses, cleaning a house that gets dirty faster than you can keep it clean, managing supplies through winters that can kill you dead if you are not prepared for them." He paused, and when he continued, his voice had dropped lower, carrying a weight that was not threat but truth. "And you will be doing all of this while living under the same roof as 3 men who have not been in the company of a woman in 6 years." The words settled over the room like snow. Quiet, inescapable, each one precisely placed. Laurel felt heat rise in her face at the implication, but she did not look away. She had not survived Aldrich Whitfield's groping hands and Cordelia's iron control in a 200-foot fall down a mountainside only to be intimidated by honesty. "I can handle hard work," she said, "and I am perfectly capable of maintaining proper boundaries." "Proper boundaries," Jude repeated, and something that might have been bitter amusement flickered across his features. "Right, because those exist up here," he turned to his brother. "This is a mistake, Rowan. She is going to complicate everything. It is not going to end well." "But it is her choice," Phelan said quietly from the table, his green eyes moving between the brothers with the calm of a man accustomed to mediating between stronger personalities. "Just as it was our choice to offer her the position. And we have offered it, so unless she wants to refuse, we are done debating." Laurel looked between the 3 men, seeing the tension that hummed between them like electricity before a storm. The disagreement that was really about something deeper than her presence. Old wounds, old fears, the scarred tissue of losses they had each survived in their own way and were still, years later, learning to live around. Jude's anger was not really about her. It was about Odette, about the woman who had left him at the altar and taken his trust with her. Every woman who came close was a potential repetition of that betrayal, and he was guarding himself the only way he knew how, with walls built from hostility and suspicion. Rowan's careful control was not really about maintaining order. It was about Marin and Elise, about coming home to find his wife and daughter already in the ground, their graves fresh and raw in the earth, about the particular agony of a man who had failed to protect the people he loved most and had spent every day since trying to atone for that failure by protecting everything else. And Phelan's gentleness was not weakness. It was the strength of a man who had chosen compassion over bitterness, who had looked at loss and decided to remain soft instead of growing hard. Perhaps the bravest choice of the three. She should refuse. She knew this with the rational part of her mind that was still capable of functioning. Should take Jude's offer and return to whatever life she could scrape together in the East. A governess position in another city, a boarding house room, the gray, grinding anonymity of a woman alone in the world. But something in her, some reckless impulse she had never indulged before, the same impulse that had made her steal money and climb aboard a stagecoach in the dead of night, that impulse spoke before caution could stop it. I will stay. The three words hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Irreversible, irrevocable, already changing the shape of everything they touched. Rowan nodded slowly, his expression giving nothing away. Jude cursed under his breath and turned to stare out the window at the mountains, his jaw tight, his hands clenched at his sides. Phelan smiled, small and satisfied, the expression of a man who had bet on an outcome and won. Then it is settled, Rowan said. You stay until spring. We pay you fair wages, provide room and board. In return, you manage the household, cooking, cleaning, basic organization. We handle the ranch work. You handle the domestic side. He paused, and when he continued, his voice had hardened, each word laid down like a stone in a wall being built. And we all maintain appropriate distance. That last sentence seemed aimed less at L'Oreal than at the two men standing behind her, a directive, a boundary drawn in words for people who might need reminding where the line was. Appropriate distance, Laurel echoed. Of course. Rowan's ice-gray eyes held hers, and in them she saw something that looked very much like a man trying to convince himself of something he was not entirely sure he believed. I am serious about this, he said. We are isolated here. Things can get complicated fast when boundaries are not respected. For everyone's safety, including yours, we need to keep this professional. I understand, Laurel said. And she did understand. She understood the words perfectly. What she was less certain about was whether understanding and compliance were the same thing, whether knowing where the line was and staying behind it were the same thing at all. So when do I start, she asked, because practical questions were safer than philosophical ones. Today, if you are able, Phelan said, rising from the table with the ease of a man whose body had never learned what stiffness felt like. The kitchen needs organizing. We have been three men trying to cook for ourselves for 6 years, and the results have not been pretty. Food stores need inventory before winter locks us in completely. And we should probably discuss what we actually eat before you start cooking meals we cannot stomach. Laurel stood, ignoring the way her head spun slightly and her ribs protested the sudden change in altitude. Then let us begin. I am not one to waste time. She moved around the kitchen opening cupboards, assessing supplies, making mental notes with the efficient precision of someone trained to manage a household from the ground up. Her hands moved automatically, years of domestic training taking over while her mind processed the larger picture. The stores were adequate but disorganized. Flour stored next to turpentine, sugar in a container that had no lid, dried beans mixed with dried corn in the same barrel, salt pork stacked in a way that would cause the bottom pieces to spoil before the top ones were eaten. It was not neglect exactly, but the particular chaos that resulted when capable men applied their competence to tasks they had never been taught to do properly. She could fix this. She could bring order to this kitchen, to this household, to the domestic machinery of three men's lives. She had been trained for exactly this, even if the setting was nothing like the Philadelphia parlors and schoolrooms where that training had been intended to be deployed. What the three men did not see, as they watched her work with expressions that ranged from Phelan's quiet approval to Rowan's watchful assessment, to Jude's grudging acknowledgement that she seemed to know what she was doing, was the way her hands trembled when she was not holding something, or the way she had to pause and breathe deeply when the room tilted slightly on its axis, or the fear she hid beneath competence, layered so carefully beneath capability that it was invisible to anyone who was not looking for it. She was terrified of the mountain, of the winter coming, of the isolation that would seal her in this house with three men she did not know for months on end, with no escape, no recourse, no one to call for help if things went wrong. But more than that, she was terrified of herself, of the strange electricity that crackled through her body every time one of them moved close, of the awareness that lived in her skin, now an alertness she had never felt before, as if every nerve in her body had been tuned to a frequency that only these three men broadcast on. Laurel Prescott had spent 24 years learning to control herself, to manage her impulses, her desires, her emotions, to fold them into shapes that fit inside the narrow box that society had built for women like her. She had become expert at it, a master of the art of not feeling what she felt. But on Kestrel Peak Ranch, with three mountain men who looked at her like she was something they had been waiting for without knowing it, she suspected that her practiced control was about to be tested in ways it had never been tested before. By the end of the first week, Laurel had established a routine that brought order to the chaos and purpose to her days. She woke before dawn each morning, when the darkness outside the windows was absolute, and the only sounds were the creak of the house settling in the cold and the distant, mournful howl of a coyote somewhere on the ridge. She started fires. Kitchen stove first, then the main fireplace building, each one with the methodical care Phelan had shown her. Paper first, then kindling, then small pieces, then larger ones, each layer placed with intention, the architecture of heat. She prepared breakfast for three men who ate quantities that would have been comical if she had not been the one cooking it. Mountains of eggs, stacks of flapjacks, rashers of bacon laid in rows like fallen soldiers. Pots of coffee that emptied and refilled and emptied again. She cleaned. She organized. She took inventory of the supplies that would need to last through a winter that could arrive any day and would not leave for 5 months. Salt, flour, sugar, coffee, dried beans, dried corn, preserved fruits, smoked and salted meats. Everything counted, everything cataloged, everything stored properly. The turpentine moved far from the flour, the sugar given a lid, the dried goods separated and labeled. She learned where things belonged and how the household functioned and what rhythms governed life on this isolated ranch. Mornings for cooking and indoor work. Afternoons for the men to handle livestock, repair fences, cut firewood, do the 1,000 tasks that kept a mountain ranch running. Evenings around the four of them existing in the same space with the careful choreography of people who were still learning each other's shapes. The men gave her space. They were careful about it. Almost too careful, maintaining a distance that felt deliberate, as if they had discussed it among themselves and agreed on specific parameters. How close they would stand, how long they would stay in a room where she was working, how their eyes would behave when she bent to lift something or reached up to a high shelf. They did not touch her unnecessarily, did not linger in doorways or find excuses to be near her. They treated her with a respect that bordered on formality, addressing her as Miss Prescott, nodding politely when they passed in the hall, keeping conversations focused on practical matters. Food, weather, supplies, the mundane infrastructure of daily survival. And somehow that distance made Laurel more aware of them, not less. She found herself listening for their footsteps, learning to distinguish between them. Rowan's heavy, deliberate stride, each step placed with the precision of a man who never wasted movement. Jude's quicker pace, restless and slightly irregular, the walk of someone whose body could not quite contain his energy. Phelan's measured tread, steady and unhurried, the walk of a man who had decided long ago that the world would wait for him rather than the other way around. She noticed things she should not have noticed, had no business noticing. How Rowan moved through the world with the contained power of something predatory, all controlled strength and coiled readiness, as if at any moment he might need to react to a threat, and wanted to be certain his body would not fail him. How Jude's rare smiles, offered reluctantly and withdrawn quickly, transformed his severe features into something that was almost beautiful, the hardness dissolving for a heartbeat to reveal the younger, less guarded man he must have been before Odette broke something in him. How Phelan's gentle voice could still carry absolute authority when the situation demanded it, shifting from warmth to command without transition, like a river that could be calm one moment and rapids the next. She noticed how they worked together with silent coordination, anticipating each other's needs, compensating for each other's weaknesses, functioning as a unit that was more than the sum of its three very large parts. a system perfected by years of isolation and necessity, a language of gesture and glance that excluded her not by intention, but by the simple fact that she had not yet learned to speak it. And she noticed, though she tried with increasing desperation, not to how their work clothes strained across broad shoulders when they lifted heavy loads, how their hands were scarred from years of hard labor, the skin rough and calloused, mapped with the history of every fence post they had driven, and every rope they had pulled, and every wound they had earned and healed. How they carried the scent of leather and pine and honest labor, a smell that was nothing like the cologne and pomade of Philadelphia men, and that affected her in ways she did not have vocabulary for. These observations felt dangerous. They lived in a part of her mind that she had always kept locked, the room where improper thoughts were stored, the place where a proper woman put the feelings that had no place in polite society. Laurel had been trained to ignore that room, to walk past its door without pausing, to pretend it did not exist. But on Kestrel Peak Ranch, in a house where three men breathed and moved and existed with an intensity that made the air itself feel different, the door to that room was developing cracks. She pushed the observations aside, focused on her work, maintained the professional distance Rowan had insisted upon with the same rigid discipline she had used to survive Cordelia's household. It was, she told herself, simply a matter of will, of choosing not to feel what she felt, of being the governess she had been trained to be rather than the woman she was discovering she might actually be. During that first week, two moments occurred that cracked the wall she was building, two encounters that left marks she could not cover with propriety or erase with discipline. The first was with Phelan. It happened on the fourth evening after supper had been cleared and the men had settled into their customary places around the fire. Rowan in the large chair nearest the hearth, staring into the flames with the intensity of a man looking for answers in the light. Jude on the floor with his back against the wall, a position that let him see both the door and the windows, the habit of someone who never quite stopped watching for threats. Phelan sat at the far end of the table, and as Laurel came to wipe its surface clean, she saw what he was reading. The book in his hands was small and worn, its cover soft from years of handling. She recognized it instantly. Wordsworth, the same poet whose collected works had served as her treasury and her talisman. The book she had lost on the mountainside along with everything else. She stopped, stared, and something in her chest constricted with the pain that had nothing to do with her healing ribs. Phelan looked up, sensing her stillness. His green eyes moved from her face to the book and back, and she saw understanding dawn in them. Not just recognition of the title, but comprehension of what it meant to her. Why she had stopped, why her breath had caught, why her eyes were suddenly bright with tears she would not allow to fall. "You know Wordsworth," he said, not a question. He was my favorite, Laurel managed. I had a copy, had it for years. It was in the stagecoach when it went over. She did not mention the money hidden in its pages, did not mention that the book's loss represented not just a sentimental wound, but a practical catastrophe. Some things were too raw for casual conversation. Phelan held the book out to her. "You can borrow this whenever you like." Their fingers touched when she took it, a brief contact, skin against skin, lasting perhaps half a second, insignificant by any objective measure. But the sensation traveled up Laurel's arm like electricity, sharp and hot and entirely disproportionate to the stimulus that had caused it. She sat down at the table without being invited, opened the book to a random page, and for a moment they simply existed in the same silence, sharing the same words across the same scarred table. Then Phelan spoke again, his voice low enough that it did not carry to the men by the fire. "I was at university in Boston for 2 years, studied literature and philosophy, had a professor named Aldrich who made us memorize Wordsworth by the page. I complained at the time, thought it was pointless torture. Now I cannot imagine my life without these words." Laurel looked at him. "What happened? Why did you leave?" "Family lost the farm. Debts my father had hidden for years came due all at once. There was nothing left. No money for tuition, no home to go back to. I was 20 years old with 2 years of education that qualified me for nothing practical and a head full of poetry that could not feed me or anyone else." His smile was wry, self-deprecating. "I came west because I could not go back. Fell in with Rowan and Jude because they needed help on the ranch, and I needed a place to exist. Learned to work with my hands. Learned that the body can do more than the mind gives it credit for. Learn that poetry and practical work are not opposites, but partners. He paused, turning his coffee cup in his hands. I came here because I had no choice, he said. Then I discovered this is where I belong. Laurel held his gaze across the table and something shifted between them. Not dramatically, not with the sudden force of revelation, more like a door opening a quarter inch, letting a thin blade of light through. Enough to see by, not enough to see everything. We are the same, she said quietly. Both of us running from lives that collapsed. Both of us ending up somewhere we never expected. Yes, Phelan said, and his green eyes held something that was not hunger or desire or any of the things she had been trained to fear from men. It was recognition, the particular intimacy of being truly seen by another person, of having someone look at you and understand not just who you are but winding. They talked until the fire burned low. About Wordsworth and Keats and whether Shelley was overrated, about what education meant in a place where survival took precedence over scholarship, about the strange alchemy that turned tragedy into strength, or at least into endurance, which was sometimes the same thing. When Laurel finally rose to go to her room, the house was quiet. Rowan and Jude had retired hours ago. The fire was coals and ash. The windows showed nothing but darkness and the faint reflection of lamplight. Thank you, she said at the door, for the conversation. I had forgotten what it felt like to talk to someone who values ideas. Phelan's smile in the lamp was something she would remember for a very long time. Do not thank me, he said. I am the one who should be grateful. It has been 6 years since anyone in this house could tell me whether Shelley was overrated. She went to bed that night thinking about green eyes and poetry and the way a man's voice could make familiar words sound entirely new. And she thought about the room in her mind where improper thoughts were stored and noticed that the cracks in its door had grown wider. The second moment came 3 days later, and it involved Jude. It was early morning before dawn. Laurel had woken to the sound of wind against the windows and the particular quality of silence that meant snow was falling. She rose and dressed and stepped into the kitchen to start the fire moving through the darkness with the growing confidence of someone learning the geography of a new home. She built the fire in the stove and stood warming her hands while the room slowly brightened around her. Then she heard a sound from outside. Not an alarming sound, not an animal or an intruder, something quieter, the scratch of lead on paper. Curiosity pulled her to the kitchen door. She opened it silently and looked out onto the covered porch. Jude sat on the top step, his back against the porch post, a large sketchbook balanced on his drawn-up knees. He was drawing with a piece of graphite, his hand moving across the paper with the quick, sure strokes of someone who had been doing this for years. His hazel eyes were fixed on the landscape before him, the mountains emerging from darkness as the first gray light of pre-dawn touched the snow on their peaks. He had not heard her open the door. His concentration was absolute, his entire being focused on the act of translation, taking the mountains and the light and the falling snow and turning them into marks on paper, finding the lines that mattered and ignoring the ones that did not. It was a skill that required not just technical ability, but a kind of vision, the ability to see the essential shape of things beneath their surface appearance. Laurel watched for a moment, moved by the unexpected beauty of it. This hard, guarded, suspicious man with his armor of anger and his walls of distrust, sitting alone in the cold making art. The contradiction was striking and somehow perfect. The hardest shells she had learned at Preston Academy often protected the most vulnerable interiors. Then her weight shifted and the floorboard creaked. Jude's head snapped up, his eyes finding hers in the gray light. Something flashed across his face. Surprise. Then something closer to panic. Then anger, the default emotion he used to cover everything else. His hand moved to close the sketchbook, a reflex as automatic as flinching from a flame, hiding the evidence, concealing the vulnerable thing before anyone could use it against him. Wait, Laurel said. She stepped onto the porch, pulling her shawl tighter against the cold. Please do not close it. I was not spying. I just heard the sound and was curious. Jude's jaw was tight, the muscle jumping under the skin. His hand hovered over the open page, caught between the impulse to hide and the unfamiliar experience of being asked not to. Laurel chose her words carefully. She had spent years learning to read people, to understand what they needed to hear in order to lower their defenses. It was a skill essential for any governess. doubly so for one who worked in households where the dynamics were complicated and the emotions were sharp. I taught art at Preston Academy, she said. Perspective composition, use of light. It was my favorite subject to teach because it required students to see the world differently than they were accustomed to seeing it. She paused, letting the words settle. Your handling of the light is beautiful, she said. The way you have captured how it moves across the snow, the gradation from shadow to illumination, that is not something that can be taught. That is something you see because it is in you. Jude stared at her. His hazel eyes were wide with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not anger, not suspicion, not the guarded hostility he wore like a second skin. Something younger, something surprised, something that looked very much like a man discovering that a door he had thought was locked could actually be open. He did not say anything for a long moment. The snow fell around them in soft, unhurried spirals. The light continued to change the mountains, shifting from gray to pale gold as dawn approached. Then Jude turned the sketchbook toward her, slowly, reluctantly, the way a man shows a wound to a doctor, not wanting to but knowing he has to. The page was covered in sketches. Not just the mountain landscape she had glimpsed, but others. A horse mid-gallop, its mane streaming. The kitchen fireplace with flames rendered in graphite so skillfully they seemed to flicker on the paper. A portrait of Rowan in profile, the scar on his jaw rendered with loving detail, his expression caught in a rare moment of unguarded thought. They were extraordinary, raw and technically accomplished, and filled with an emotional depth that belied the hardness of the man who had created them. Jude Laurel breathed. These are remarkable. He closed the sketchbook then, but gently. Not slamming it shut, but folding it closed the way you close a door on a room you are leaving voluntarily rather than fleeing from. Do not tell the others, he said. His voice was rough, but the hostility was gone. In its place was something fragile. Trust. A tiny tentative amount offered with the caution of someone who had been badly burned and was testing whether this new flame would burn him too. I will not, Laurel promised. She turned to go back inside, giving him the privacy she sensed he needed. But at the door she paused and looked back. Jude, she said, do not stop drawing. Whatever happens, do not stop. He did not respond. But when she glanced out the window 20 minutes later, while preparing breakfast, she saw that he had opened the sketchbook again. His hand was moving across the paper, and something in his posture had changed, some fraction of the tension released, as if a knot that had been tied for years had loosened just enough to let him breathe a little deeper. From that morning forward, Jude was different with her. Not warm, not yet. The walls were still there, thick and high, and reinforced by years of hurt. But there were windows in them now. Small openings through which she could sometimes glimpse the man behind the fortress, and through which he could sometimes glimpse her. It was not much. A reduction in hostility, an occasional nod that bordered on friendly, a willingness to remain in a room when she entered instead of immediately finding a reason to leave. But in a household where emotions were managed as carefully as supplies, and where a single misplaced word could shift the entire atmosphere, these small changes mattered. They mattered enormously. 2 weeks into her time at Kestrel Peak, Laurel stood in the kitchen at midnight, unable to sleep. Her ribs were healing well, the bruising fading from purple to yellow, the pain reducing from sharp to dull to barely noticeable unless she moved wrong. The gash on her head had closed cleanly, leaving a thin scar at her hairline that her hair would eventually cover. She was physically recovering, getting stronger each day, her body responding to the hard work and clean mountain air and solid food with a resilience that surprised her. The governess who had arrived half dead on the back of a stranger's horse was being replaced by something harder. Something that could lift a full water kettle without wincing and split kindling with an axe and walk to the barn in 3 feet of snow without losing her breath. But it was not her body keeping her awake tonight. She stood by the kitchen window looking out at the mountains under moonlight. The snow had stopped days ago, but the world was still white, the landscape transformed into something ethereal and strange. Moonlight on snow created a brightness that was not quite day, but was far more than night. An in-between light, a light for thinking thoughts that belonged neither to the waking world nor to dreams. She was thinking about the 3 men sleeping in this house, about Rowan's controlled intensity and Phelan's gentle wisdom, and the drawings Jude made when he thought no one was watching. about the way they had each separately and in their own way begun to occupy spaces in her mind that she had not known were empty until they filled them. She was thinking about what Jude had said that first morning. Three men who have not been in the company of a woman in 6 years, and about what Rowan had said, appropriate distance, and about what neither of them had said, but what she could feel the way you could feel a storm approaching long before you saw the clouds. Something was building between her and these three men in this house on this mountain in this winter that was sealing them in more tightly with each passing day. Something was building. She could feel it in the quality of the silences, in the way their eyes lingered a fraction of a second too long, in the way the air changed temperature when Rowan stood close to her, or the way her heart rate shifted when Felon's hand brushed hers over the coffee pot, or the way her skin flushed when she caught Jude watching her from across the room. Professional distance. The words sounded thin and unconvincing in the midnight silence of the kitchen. A paper wall against a mountain wind. The kind of thing you said to convince yourself that what was happening was not actually happening, that what was building was not actually building, that the line you had drawn was strong enough to hold against forces that neither lines nor words were equipped to contain. Laurel pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the window and closed her eyes. Behind her lids, she saw three faces. Three men. Three separate kinds of danger and three separate kinds of salvation tangled together in a knot she did not know how to untie. The governess who had left Philadelphia would have been appalled, would have retreated to her room and locked the door and prayed for guidance and strength and the restoration of proper feelings. But the woman standing in this kitchen, the woman the mountain was making that woman, was not appalled. She was awake, more awake than she had been in years. Every nerve singing, every sense heightened, every particle of her being tuned to a frequency she had never known existed. And that terrified her more than the stagecoach accident, more than the mountain or the winter or the isolation, because the crash had threatened only her body. What was happening now, what was building between her and these three men in this house at the edge of the world that threatened something far more precious and far more fragile, her certainty about who she was. Laurel returned to her bed and lay in the darkness listening to the house settle around her. Somewhere in the silence, a floorboard creaked. One of the men moving in his sleep, or perhaps not sleeping at all. Perhaps lying awake in his own room, staring at his own ceiling, thinking his own dangerous thoughts about the woman sleeping 30 feet away behind a door that had no lock. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but sleep like propriety, like appropriate distance, like all the rules she had built her life around, refused to cooperate. Outside, the mountain waited, patient as stone, cold as the truth, and absolutely terrifyingly indifferent to the plans that human beings made to keep themselves safe from each other. From themselves, winter was coming, and with it something that none of them were prepared for, something that no amount of planning or boundary setting or professional distance could prevent. The mountain would see to that. The mountain always did. On the morning of the 8th day, Laurel made a mistake that changed the temperature of everything. She rose before dawn, as usual, moving through the darkness of her room with the growing confidence of someone learning new geography by feel. The floor was cold under her bare feet, the November air sharp against her skin as she pulled her shawl over her nightgown and padded into the kitchen. The stove had gone cold overnight, the last coals reduced to gray powder, and she knelt to rebuild the fire with the efficiency Phelan had taught her, layering paper and kindling and small splits of pine until the flame caught and steadied. Then she stood and reached for the heavy iron kettle that sat on the shelf above the stove. It was a substantial piece of equipment, cast iron blackened by years of daily use, holding perhaps 2 gallons when full. She had lifted it every morning since arriving, had filled it with water from the pump and set it on the stove for coffee and washing and all the small daily rituals that required hot water. But this morning her healing ribs chose precisely the wrong moment to remind her that they were not yet fully mended. She reached up, gripped the handle, and lifted. The movement pulled at muscles that were still knitting themselves back together, and a bolt of pain shot through her left side, so sudden and so sharp that her hands opened involuntarily. The kettle dropped. Suddenly Rowan was there. She had not heard him enter, had not heard his footsteps or the door opening or any of the sounds that should have preceded his arrival. He was simply there the way a wall is there, solid and immovable, his large hand catching the kettle before it could crash to the floor, and the other hand gripping her elbow, steadying her as she gasped and swayed. The dual sensation of pain in her ribs and the sudden shocking warmth of his hand on her bare skin, where the nightgown sleeve had ridden up, sent her nervous system into a confusion it was not equipped to resolve. She drew in a sharp breath that had nothing to do with her ribs and everything to do with the proximity of 6.5 feet of mountain man standing close enough for her to feel the heat radiating from his body like a stove. "What are you doing?" Rowan said. His voice was rough with sleep, deeper than usual, carrying the particular graveled quality of someone who has been pulled from dreams into sudden action. His gray eyes were alert despite the hour assessing her with the clinical efficiency she had come to associate with him. "My job," Laurel said, trying to modulate her voice into something that did not betray the way her pulse was hammering. "The kettle needed filling. Not if it means injuring yourself worse." Rowan set the kettle down on the stove with a controlled movement that made the heavy iron look weightless. Then he turned to face her fully, and Laurel became acutely aware of several things simultaneously. That she was standing in her nightgown and shawl and nothing else. That the kitchen was lit only by the small fire she had just built, casting them both in flickering amber light that softened edges and deepened shadows. That Rowan was wearing only trousers and an unbuttoned shirt, his chest visible in the gap dark hair against skin that looked warm and solid in the firelight. That they were standing less than 2 feet apart and the distance felt both too much and not nearly enough. "Why did you not tell us your ribs were still causing you pain?" Rowan said. It was not a question that expected a comfortable answer. "Because they are healing fine," Laurel insisted, taking a half step backward and immediately regretting it because the retreat felt like an admission of something she was not prepared to admit. "I simply moved wrong. Let me see." The two words landed in the silence of the kitchen with the weight of stones dropped into still water. Not a request, not a suggestion. A statement of intent from a man accustomed to examining injuries with the practical detachment of someone who had spent years tending wounded animals and wounded men. Laurel stiffened. "Absolutely not. That is completely improper." "I am checking for damage," Rowan said, and his tone made clear that he did not share her assessment of the impropriety. His eyes held hers without apology. "You could have cracked ribs that are not healing correctly. If a broken rib shifts and punctures a lung, you will die before we can get you to a doctor. The nearest physician is in Copper Bend. 3 hours ride. In winter, it could be 5. By the time we got you there and back, if something was seriously wrong, it could be much worse. Then I will have a doctor examine me when the weather permits," Laurel said, trying to put the conversation back on the rails of civilized interaction. "The weather does not permit," Rowan said, "and it may not for weeks. Are you willing to risk your life on the chance that your self-diagnosis is correct?" They stood there in the pre-dawn darkness of the kitchen, the fire crackling softly in the stove, the first pale suggestion of dawn showing through the windows. Two people engaged in a battle of wills that was about medical concern on the surface and about something entirely different underneath. "Fine," Laurel said finally, "but only because you are right about the distance to a doctor." She turned away from him and with hands that she willed to be steady, lifted the hem of her nightgown to just below her rib cage, exposing the left side of her torso, where the bruising had been worst. Even she was startled by what she saw. The bruising had improved dramatically from the spectacular purple and black of the first days, but what remained was still vivid, yellow and green, spreading across her rib cage in a pattern that looked like a map of some violent country. The skin was still tender to the touch, still sensitive to pressure, still sending clear signals that the damage beneath had not yet fully resolved. Rowan's expression darkened as he assessed the bruising. He reached out and Laurel held very still as his fingers ghosted along the edges of the discolored skin. His touch was clinical, precise, the touch of a man who had examined hundreds of injured animals and knew exactly how to palpate for damage without causing additional harm. "Does this hurt?" Light pressure on her lower ribs. Laurel swallowed. "A little. Here." His hand moved, higher fingers spread across her side, pressing gently but firmly enough to assess the bone beneath. "No. What about here?" Different angle, different rib testing, the integrity of each one with methodical thoroughness. Laurel drew in a breath. "That one, yes. More than the others." Rowan's hands dropped away, and he stepped back, and the air between them seemed to decompress as if a pressure valve had been released. His expression had shifted from clinical assessment to something she could not quite read. Concern, certainly, but also something else. something he folded away quickly like a letter read and returned to its envelope before anyone else could see the contents. "Nothing feels broken," he said, "but you need to be more careful. No heavy lifting for at least another week. I will fill the kettle in the mornings until your ribs are fully healed. I have work to do." Laurel protested, pulling her nightgown back into place with hands that were not as steady as she would have liked. "I cannot ask you to do kitchen chores on top of everything else." "You are not asking," Rowan said. "I am telling you. There is a difference." He held her gaze for a moment longer, and in his ice-gray eyes, Laurel saw the thing he was not saying, the thing that lived beneath the clinical efficiency and the practical concern and the reasonable medical arguments. She saw a man who was afraid, not of her injury, not of the inconvenience her death would cause, but of the possibility of standing beside another grave on this mountain, of burying another woman he had failed to protect. Marin, the wife who had died while he was away, the daughter Elise who had been lowered into the earth before he even knew she was sick. Those ghosts lived in his eyes, permanent residents that would never be evicted. And they were the real reason he had appeared in the kitchen at dawn, the real reason he had caught the kettle before it fell, the real reason he was now insisting on filling it himself every morning. Not because he doubted her capability, but because he could not bear to lose someone else. "Thank you," Laurel said softly. And she was thanking him not just for the offer to help, but for the thing beneath it, the caring that he hid behind authority, because showing it directly would require a vulnerability he was not yet ready for. Rowan nodded once and turned away, and the moment was over. But something had shifted between them. Some invisible barrier had been adjusted, moved a few inches in a direction that neither of them could undo. Not breached, not destroyed, but repositioned. And both of them knew it. The days that followed were a study in the particular tension that exists between people who are pretending not to feel what they feel. Laurel threw herself into her work with redoubled intensity, organizing the household with the same fierce precision she had once applied to lesson plans and curriculum development. She reorganized the pantry entirely, creating a system of labeling and rotation that would prevent spoilage and ensure nothing was wasted. She mended clothes that had gone unrepaired for months. The men's shirts and trousers bearing evidence of hard use and no one available to stitch the tears. She learned to cook the heavy-calorie, dense meals that mountain work demanded, adapting her mother's recipes for a kitchen that lacked half the ingredients and all of the refinement she was accustomed to. And slowly, incrementally, she began to discover the individual textures of each man's character, not through dramatic revelations or passionate confessions, but through the small, accumulating details of daily life. The things people reveal about themselves when they are not trying to reveal anything at all. Rowan, she learned, was a man at war with his own tenderness. He had built a fortress around himself after Marin and Elise died, constructed it from authority and control, and the iron discipline of a man who believed that if he could simply manage everything well enough, nothing bad would ever happen again. But the fortress had cracks. She saw them in the way he talked to the horses, his voice dropping to a register so gentle it was almost unrecognizable. In the way he built fires, each one constructed with an attention to detail that bordered on devotion, as if the warmth he created was a substitute for the warmth he had lost. In the way he checked her bandage every morning, his scarred fingers touching the healing wound with a delicacy that made her chest ache. Jude, she learned, was not the angry man he presented to the world. The anger was real, certainly, but it was armor, not architecture. Beneath it lived a man of extraordinary sensitivity who had been hurt so deeply by Odette's betrayal that he had concluded feeling things was simply too dangerous and had resolved to stop. An impossible resolution, of course. Human beings cannot stop feeling any more than they can stop breathing. They can only hide what they feel, bury it, armor themselves against it. And the armor over time becomes indistinguishable from the person wearing it. But Jude's art gave him away. Laurel saw more of his sketches in the following days, not because he showed them to her, but because she had learned where he kept his sketchbook and had developed the habit of glancing at it when it lay open on the porch or the kitchen table. The drawings were windows into the real Jude, the one who lived behind the walls. They showed a man who saw beauty everywhere, in the curl of smoke from a chimney, in the pattern of frost on a window pane, in the way light fell across a sleeping dog's face. And she noticed with a flutter she tried to suppress in the way he drew her arm. She found a page one afternoon while he was out checking fence lines, a page he had left face down on the kitchen table, And when she turned it over, she found herself looking at herself. Not a posed portrait, but a captured moment. Laurel reading by the fire, her face lit from below by the flames, her expression unguarded, her lips slightly parted, her eyes focused on whatever page had held her attention. It was the first time she had ever seen herself through someone else's eyes. Not the mirror's cold reflection, but a living interpretation filtered through another person's perception and rendered with skill and attention that amounted to a kind of devotion. The woman in the drawing was not the governess she saw in the mirror, not the thin, pale, frightened woman with the bandage on her head and the dark circles under her eyes. The woman Jude had drawn was beautiful, strong, alive in a way that had nothing to do with physical beauty and everything to do with presence, with the particular radiance of a person who is exactly where she is supposed to be, doing exactly what she is supposed to be doing, even if she does not know it yet. Laurel stared at the drawing for a long time. Then she placed it face down exactly as she had found it and said nothing when Jude returned and slipped it back into his sketchbook with the quick, furtive movements of a man hiding evidence. But that night, lying in her bed in the darkness, she felt tears slide down her temples and into her hair. Not tears of sadness, tears of something she did not have a name for. Something that lived in the space between gratitude and longing, between being seen and wanting to be touched. Phelan continued to be her anchor to intellectual life, the connection that kept her mind from atrophying under the relentless physical demands of ranch work. Their evening conversations became a ritual she depended on a fixed point in the turning days. They discussed everything, literature and philosophy and politics and science, and the nature of courage, and the difference between being alone and being lonely. One evening, 2.5 weeks into her stay, they found themselves in a conversation about education and its purpose that lasted until the fire was nothing but glowing coals and the house was silent around them. "You are not just a governess who ran away," Phelan said, his green eyes steady on hers across the table. "You are one of the most intelligent people I have ever met, man or woman. And I have known university professors and Boston intellectuals and men who consider themselves great thinkers. None of them could hold a conversation the way you do. None of them could muddle between ideas with the agility you show." He paused, and when he continued, his voice was quieter but somehow more intense. "Do not ever let anyone tell you that you are only a woman, that your mind is secondary to your function, that your value lies in what you can do for others rather than what you are in yourself." Laurel felt something crack inside her when he said that. Something small and hard and very old, a calcified belief she had carried since childhood, that her worth was measured by her usefulness, by how well she served others, by how perfectly she performed the role assigned to her. Phelan had just told her that she mattered not for what she did, but for who she was. And no one in 24 years of life had ever said that to her before. She could not respond. If she opened her mouth, she would cry, and she was not ready to cry in front of him, not yet. So she simply nodded and went to her bed and lay in the dark with her hand pressed against her mouth to muffle the sounds of weeping that came from somewhere so deep inside her she had not known the place existed. 3 weeks after Laurel's arrival at Kestrel Peak Ranch, with the bonds between the four of them tightening invisibly with each passing day, the night came that shattered every boundary they had built. The mare's scream woke Laurel at 2 in the morning. She had been dreaming, though she could not remember of what, and the sound tore through her sleep like a blade through fabric, pulling her upright in bed with her heart slamming against her ribs. The sound was primal, agonized, the kind of sound that bypassed thought entirely and went straight to the oldest part of the brain, the part that understood on an instinctive animal level that another creature was in mortal distress. Something was dying. Something was fighting to live. Laurel threw her shawl over her nightgown and ran. Not walked, not hesitated. Ran barefoot through the dark house, through the kitchen, out the back door into the November night. The cold hit her like a wall of ice, driving the breath from her lungs, the frozen ground burning against the soles of her bare feet. But she did not slow down. Could not. The mare's screaming pulled her forward with the irresistible force of a rope tied to her chest. The barn was 100 yards from the house, its doors thrown open, lamplight spilling from the interior in a golden flood that turned the snow outside into a carpet of warm light. Someone had gotten there before her. All three of them. Inside the barn, chaos reigned. The pregnant mare thrashed in her stall, her massive body heaving, her eyes rolling white with terror and pain. Straw flew in all directions as her hooves struck the wooden walls, each impact shuddering through the structure. Sweat darkened her coat to black, running in rivulets down her flanks, pooling in the straw beneath her. The air was thick with the smell of animal fear and blood, and the particular earthy scent of birth approaching. Rowan was at the mare's head, his large hands gripping the halter, his body braced against her, panicked, lunging. He was speaking to her in a low, continuous stream of words that were not words really, but sounds, a rhythm of calm that he was trying to impose on the animal's terror through sheer force of will. His shirt was already soaked with the mare's sweat, his arms straining against her strength. Jude held a lantern high, the flame inside its glass chimney, casting dancing golden light across the scene. Shadows leaped and twisted on the walls. His face was drawn tight with concentration, his jaw set, his hazel eyes fixed on the mare's hindquarters, where the problem was. Phelan knelt behind the mare, his sleeves rolled past his elbows, his forearms already slicked with blood and fluid. His expression was grim in a way that Laurel had never seen from him. The gentle green eyes were hard now, focused, the warmth replaced by the cold clarity of a man facing a crisis he was not certain he could resolve. "Foal is breached," Phelan said without looking up, his voice tight with controlled urgency. "I cannot turn it. The legs are folded back, and the head is in the wrong position. She is going to die if we do not get it out soon, and the foal with her." The words hung in the lamplight like smoke, two lives balanced on the edge of a blade. Laurel did not think, did not hesitate, did not consider propriety or boundaries or the fact that she was barefoot in a barn in her nightgown at 2 in the morning. She moved to the mare's side, her hands going to the animal's slick neck, feeling the massive muscles bunching and trembling beneath her palms. The mare's skin was hot, fevered with pain and effort, and the pulse that throbbed beneath Laurel's fingers was fast and erratic. "What do you need me to do?" she said. Rowan's ice-gray eyes found hers across the mare's heaving body. For a moment, something passed between them that had nothing to do with horses or veterinary emergencies or any of the practical concerns that should have dominated this situation. Recognition, trust. The understanding that in this moment, at this extremity, everything they had been pretending about distance and propriety and professional boundaries was exactly what it had always been. Pretense. "Hold her steady," Rowan said, his voice dropping into the register of absolute command that she had learned to recognize as his crisis mode. "Put your hands here and here. Press when I tell you to press. I need to feel where the foal is positioned." Phelan, move aside. "Let me in." Laurel placed her hands where he indicated, one on the mare's flank, the other lower on the distended belly, where she could feel the foal moving beneath the skin. The sensation was extraordinary and terrible. Life struggling inside life. A creature fighting to be born while its mother fought not to die. Rowan moved to the mare's hindquarters, stripping off his shirt without ceremony, and plunged his arms inside the animal up to his elbows. His face became a mask of absolute concentration. Eyes closed, jaw clenched so tight that the muscle jumped visibly beneath the skin. Sweat broke out on his forehead, despite the cold air running down his temples in thin streams. He was feeling his way through flesh and blood and the internal geography of a body in crisis, his hands reading what his eyes could not see. The position of the foal, the angle of the legs, the location of the head. All of it assessed by touch alone, by the particular knowledge that came from years of birthing animals on a mountain where veterinarians did not exist and you learned to do it yourself or you watched your livestock die. "Got it?" he breathed after an eternity that lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Left foreleg is folded back under the body. Head is turned to the side. I need to straighten the leg first, then rotate the head. Jude, I need more hot water. Phelan, I need you to push from outside when I say, right here. He indicated a spot on the mare's belly. Laurel, when I tell you, press down hard right where your hand is. The mare is going to fight us when I start turning the foal. She is going to try to throw us off. But we have to hold her steady, or I could tear something inside and then we lose them both. Jude moved immediately, setting down the lantern and disappearing into the darkness to fetch water from the stove in the house. Phelan positioned himself where Rowan had indicated, his large hands flat on the mare's belly, ready to push. And Laurel held her position, her hands pressed against the mare's body, feeling the animal's pain radiating through her palms like heat from a furnace. The mare's sides heaved with each labored breath. Her screams had subsided into a continuous low groaning that was somehow worse than the screaming, a sound of exhaustion and resignation that said she was giving up, that the fight was going out of her. No, Laurel said, and she was not sure if she was talking to the mare or to herself or to whatever power governed the line between life and death in a barn on a mountain in the middle of a November night. You are not going to die. Well, tonight, not here. She pressed her face against the mare's neck, feeling the hot, damp hide against her cheek, and spoke the way her mother used to speak to her when she was sick. Low and steady and absolutely certain. A voice that left no room for doubt, no room for death. Now Rowan said through gritted teeth, Phelan, push. Steady pressure right there. Laurel, press down when you feel me moving inside. Hard. Do not be gentle. They worked in silent coordination. Rowan's hands inside the mare, guiding, manipulating, working to straighten the folded leg and rotate the foal's head into the correct position. Phelan's hands on the outside of the belly, pushing with controlled force, creating counter-pressure that helped Rowan's internal maneuvers. Laurel's hands where Rowan had placed them, pressing down at precisely the right moments, following the rhythm of his terse instructions. Jude returned with hot water moving between them with quiet efficiency, bringing clean cloths, instruments, anticipating needs before they were spoken. His movements had the quality of a man who had done this before, who knew the choreography of emergency without needing to be taught. The mare screamed again, a sound that tore at Laurel's heart like hands tearing fabric. But she did not let go. She pressed harder, her feet sliding on the straw, her nightgown soaking through with sweat and blood and amniotic fluid. Almost, Rowan breathed. The leg is straightening. Almost there. Phelan, push harder. Now. Laurel down, hard. She pushed with everything she had, felt the muscles in her arms burning, felt her damaged ribs protesting with sharp lances of pain that she ignored completely because pain was irrelevant when two lives hung in the balance. Phelan's hands worked from outside, his jaw clenched, his gentle features hardened into something fierce. Rowan's arms moved inside the mare with the precision of a surgeon and the desperation of a man who knew what failure meant. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The lantern flickered. Shadows danced. The mare groaned and heaved and fought against the four sets of hands that were trying to save her life and the life inside her. And then Rowan said one word. Now. Not loud, not shouted, said with the quiet intensity of a man who had found the moment and was not going to let it pass. Push. All of you. Everything you have. Now. Laurel pushed with her entire body. Phelan drove his hands forward with a sound like a man lifting something impossibly heavy. Rowan pulled from within, his face contorted with effort, every muscle in his arms and shoulders rigid with strain. The mare gave one final agonized scream that Laurel would hear in her dreams for years afterward. And then the foal slid free. It came in a rush of blood and fluid, a dark, wet, impossibly small body that landed in the straw with a soft thump, legs folded, eyes closed. Still, too still. For one terrible moment, nothing happened. The foal lay in the straw like something that had never been alive. No movement, no breath, no sound. The silence in the barn was absolute, the kind of silence that exists in the space between one heartbeat and the next, when the entire world pauses to see which way the balance will tip. Laurel stopped breathing. Rowan's blood-covered hands hung motionless. Jude's face was white in the lamplight. Then Phelan was there. On his knees in the straw beside the foal, his hands moving with the speed of someone who knows that seconds matter. Clearing the foal's mouth and nostrils with his fingers. Rubbing its small chest vigorously with a piece of rough cloth. Working with the focused intensity of a man who refused to accept the verdict that the silence was rendering. Come on, he said, and his gentle voice had an edge Laurel had never heard before. An edge of command, of demand, of a man ordering the universe to produce a different outcome than the one it appeared to have chosen. Breathe, you have to breathe. A cough, small and wet and tentative, like the first word of a language the foal was just learning to speak. Then a cough, air entering lungs that had never held it before, expanding tissue that had never expanded, creating space where none had existed. Then a sound, a tiny indignant whinny that rose from the straw and filled the barn and broke the silence into 1,000 pieces. The mare nickered softly, maternal instinct, overriding exhaustion and pain, and every other consideration in the sudden, overwhelming imperative to reach her baby. She turned her great head, nostrils flaring, and her rough tongue found the foal and began cleaning it with the determined ancient efficiency of motherhood. They had done it. All four of them working together, hands in strength and will combined, against the darkness, had pulled two lives back from the edge. Laurel realized she was crying. Tears running down her face, cutting clean tracks through the grime and sweat and blood that covered her skin. Not tears of sadness or relief exactly, but something larger than either. Something that had to do with the miracle of what had just happened and the way four people had become one thing in the effort to achieve it. She looked up from the foal and found all three men looking at her. The expressions on their faces were not something she had seen before. Not from them, not from anyone. It was raw and unguarded and complicated, a mixture of emotions that did not have a single name because it was not a single thing. Admiration and gratitude and something deeper. Something that had been building for 3 weeks and had just been stripped of every pretense by the shared experience of fighting for life together. In Rowan's ice-gray eyes, she saw the wall crack. Just a fraction. Just enough to let something through that he had been holding back with everything he had. In Jude's hazel gaze, the last remnant of suspicion dissolved, replaced by something that looked very much like surrender. Not to her, but to the truth he had been fighting since the moment she arrived. That she belonged here. That she was not another Odette waiting to betray him. That she was something else entirely. In Phelan's green eyes, she saw what she had always seen there, the warmth and the intelligence and the recognition, but now it was unmasked, undisguised, offered without the protective filter of philosophical discussion or literary reference. Just the naked truth of what he felt written in his face like words on a page. She should be self-conscious, standing in a barn in a nightgown soaked through with sweat and blood and the visceral evidence of birth, her hair wild and loose around her face, her feet bare and filthy, every surface of her body marked with the work they had just done together. But standing there in the lamplight, feeling their eyes on her, Laurel felt something she had never felt before in her life. She felt powerful, not the power of authority or wealth or social position, something more fundamental than any of those things. The power of being essential, of being necessary, of having proven her worth not through certificates or credentials or the approval of society, but through the simple, undeniable act of showing up when it mattered and doing what needed to be done. For the first time in her 24 years, Laurel Prescott understood what it meant to be more than what the world expected of her, to exceed the boundaries that others had drawn around her potential, to discover that the shape she had been trying to fit herself into all her life was not her shape at all, and that her real shape was something larger and wilder and more capable than anyone, including herself, had ever imagined. "We should clean up," Phelan said finally. His voice was rougher than she had ever heard it, the smoothness gone, replaced by something that sounded like gravel over bedrock. "Miss Prescott, you are trembling." She was, her entire body vibrating with the after effects of adrenaline and exertion and cold and something else she could not name, or would not name. Not yet. Phelan stripped off his coat and draped it around her shoulders. The fabric was warm from his body, heavy with his scent. Cedar and wood smoke and the clean, honest smell of a man who worked hard and lived honestly. "I will walk you back to the house," he said. Rowan and Jude remained in the barn, their stated reason being to monitor the mare and foal through the rest of the night to make sure the mother did not reject the baby, to watch for signs of hemorrhage or infection. Practical reasons. Legitimate reasons. But Laurel felt their eyes follow her as she walked away from the barn with Phelan's coat around her shoulders and Phelan's hand on the small of her back. Felt the weight of their gazes like something physical, something with temperature and texture, something that pressed against her skin and left marks that would not show but would not fade. The walk back to the house was short and silent. The night was cold and clear. The storm having passed, stars spread across the sky in configurations that Laurel had never seen in Philadelphia, where city lights washed out everything but the brightest. Here the stars were thick as dust. The Milky Way, a river of light that arched from horizon to horizon, and the mountains stood black against the glittering sky like the walls of a cathedral built to a scale that defied comprehension. Phelan's hand remained on her back, warm through the coat and her damp nightgown. a point of contact that burned through fabric and skin and settled somewhere deep in her body, somewhere she had no name for, somewhere that had been cold for a very long time and was only now beginning to thaw. At the door to her room, he stopped. "What happened tonight changed things," he said quietly. Not a question, a statement. The kind of statement that required a response, not because it demanded one, but because the truth it contained was too large to leave hanging in the air without acknowledgement. "I know," Laurel whispered. "Are you afraid of what comes next?" She should say yes. Should retreat to the safety of her room and the relative sanity of distance and propriety and all the rules that govern the interactions between men and women in the civilized world. Rules that existed for good reasons. Rules that prevented complications and heartbreak and the kind of entanglement that could destroy lives. She should say yes. She should be afraid. Maybe she said instead, "But I am more afraid of going back to being the woman I was before tonight. The woman who watched from the side, who followed rules she did not believe in, who was too proper to get her hands dirty when something needed saving." Phelan's green eyes held hers in the dim light of the hallway, and in them she saw the same thing she had seen in the barn, the unmasked truth, the naked reality of what existed between them, between her and all three of these men, the thing they had all been pretending they could contain, with words like appropriate distance and professional boundaries. "You were extraordinary in there," he said. "I need you to know that. What you did tonight, how you showed up, how you fought for those animals without hesitation, that was not the behavior of a governess or a housekeeper. That was the behavior of someone who belongs here, on this mountain, in this house." He paused, and then when he continued, his voice was barely above a whisper. "With us." The words settled into the silence between them like seeds falling into prepared earth. Laurel felt them take root, felt something begin to grow in the space they created, something fragile and new and terrifying in its potential. "Good night, Phelan," she said. Because if she stayed in this hallway one moment longer, if she continued to stand this close to this man, with his coat around her shoulders, and his warmth in her skin, and his words echoing in the chambers of her heart, she would cross a line that could not be uncrossed. "Good night, Laurel," he said. And it was the first time he had used her given name, without the formal Miss Prescott preceding it. The intimacy of it struck her like a physical sensation, her name in his mouth, simple and direct and more affecting than any declaration or proposal could have been. She closed her door, leaned against it, pressed her hands flat against the wood and breathed. On the other side, she heard Phelan stand for a long moment. Then his footsteps moved away steady and measured, growing fainter, until the house was silent again. Laurel went to her bed. She did not sleep. She lay in the darkness with her eyes open, staring at the ceiling, her body still humming with the residual energy of everything that had happened. The mare, the foal, the four of them working as one, the look in their eyes afterward, Phelan's words at her door. She lay there and understood with the clarity that comes only in the small hours of the night, when pretense has been stripped away and the mind is too exhausted to lie to itself, that she was in love. Not with one man, with three. And that changed everything. The morning after the foal's birth, something in the household shifted. It was not dramatic. No declarations were made. No boundaries were explicitly renegotiated. But the air itself felt different, the way air feels different before a storm, charged with an energy that alters the quality of light and sound and the way people move through space. Rowan came into the kitchen while Laura was making breakfast, and instead of maintaining his customary distance, he stood beside her at the stove, close enough that their arms nearly touched, and showed her how to adjust the damper to control the heat more precisely. His voice was low and patient, and when his hand covered hers on the iron handle to demonstrate the proper angle, neither of them moved away. Jude left a drawing on the kitchen table, face up this time, not hidden, not tucked into his sketchbook or turned over to conceal its contents. He had drawn the foal, still wet from birth, lying in the straw with his mother's tongue on its back. And beside the foal, four sets of hands, large and small, male and female, all of them reaching, all of them connected by the act of saving a life. He did not acknowledge the drawing when he came in for breakfast, did not mention it, but he looked at Laurel as he sat down, and his hazel eyes held something that was not a wall. For the first time since she had arrived, Jude looked at her with the gates open. And Phelan called her Laurel at breakfast, naturally. without correction or apology. As if the formal address had been a garment he had outgrown overnight and simply left behind. No one commented on any of these changes. They existed in the space between words, in the territory where language could not go, communicated through gesture and glance, and the particular quality of attention that people give to others when they have stopped pretending not to care. Laurel moved through the days that followed in a state of heightened awareness that made every moment feel significant. The way Rowan's hand lingered a fraction of a second too long when he passed her the salted dinner. The way Jude positioned himself at the window where he could see both the landscape and her face while he sketched. The way Phelan found reasons to be in the kitchen during the hours she worked there, reading or writing or simply sitting in companionable silence that felt more intimate than conversation. Professional distance. The words existed still technically. No one had formally revoked them. But they hung in the air like a sign in a language no one spoke anymore, their meaning fading with each passing day, each shared glance, each small act of tenderness disguised as practicality. Something was building toward a moment of decision. Laurel could feel it, could feel the weight of it in the air, the pressure of accumulated silence and suppressed feeling, and the fundamental impossibility of four people living in a house on a mountain through a winter that sealed them in like a tomb and pretending they did not feel what they felt. The moment arrived 6 weeks after Laurel's arrival on a morning when the supply wagon made its last run before winter closed the passes entirely. Laurel was kneading bread when she heard the sound of horses and wheels on the frozen road. All four of them looked up simultaneously, a shared reaction so synchronized it would have been comical if the tension in the room had not been so immediate. Visitors were rare this far up the mountain. In deep winter, they were almost unheard of. Rowan opened the door to find the supply driver standing on the porch, a heavy coat pulled tight against the cold, a sealed letter in his gloved hand. "Message for Miss Prescott," the driver said, stomping his boots on the porch boards to shake off the snow. "From town." Lady said it was urgent. Said to make sure it got delivered before the passes closed. Laurel's hands went still in the bread dough, her fingers coated with flour curled into fists. Because no one should know she was here. No one except the people in this house and the people in Copper Bend. Unless someone had written to Philadelphia. Unless someone had informed Cordelia Pembroke that her runaway niece was alive and living on a mountain ranch in Colorado Territory. Nettie Marsh. The name surfaced in Laurel's mind with the particular chill of someone who has just understood the shape of a betrayal. The former housekeeper who had placed the false advertisements. Who had been fired for stealing. Who would have every reason to cause trouble for the men who had dismissed her. Nettie had written to Cordelia. Must have. How else would her aunt know where to find her? Laurel wiped her hands on her apron and took the letter with fingers that trembled, despite her best efforts to still them. The handwriting on the envelope was achingly familiar. Cordelia Pembroke's precise, disapproving script, each letter formed with the rigid perfection of a woman who believed that penmanship reflected moral character. She broke the seal and read, her heart sinking with each word like a stone dropped into a well. "Margaret, I know where you are and what you are doing. Nettie Marsh was kind enough to inform me of your disgraceful situation living unmarried with 3 men in the wilderness. Have you completely lost your senses? Mr. Whitfield has graciously agreed to overlook your indiscretion if you return immediately. I have hired Pinkerton detectives to ensure your safe return to Philadelphia. They will arrive within 2 weeks. Do not make this harder than it needs to be. You belong to Mr. Whitfield by contract. Your father signed the betrothal agreement before he died. It is legally binding. Return willingly or be returned by force. Your devoted Aunt Cordelia." The letter shook in Laurel's hands. The kitchen was very quiet. She could hear the fire in the stove, the tick of snow against the windows, the sound of her own breathing faster now, shallower, the breathing of someone whose cage has found her again. She looked up to find all 3 men reading over her shoulder. They had moved closer without her noticing, drawn by the change in her posture, by the trembling of her hands, by whatever invisible signal distress sends out that is picked up by people who have learned to watch for it. Their faces told her they had read every word. "Let her come," Jude said flatly, his voice carrying the particular cold certainty of a man who had decided something and would not be moved from it. "We will send her back empty-handed." "You do not understand," Laurel said, and she heard the fear in her own voice, a sound she had not heard from herself since the night she had climbed into the stagecoach in Philadelphia. "My aunt has connections, money, influence. She could bring the law. Could claim I am mentally unsound, that I fled in a state of derangement and am being held against my will. She could force me back. And the Pinkertons, they are not ordinary men. They are professionals, trained, armed. The room was silent for a heartbeat that lasted a year. Then Phelan spoke, his voice quiet, but carrying the absolute clarity of a man who has seen the solution to a problem and is simply stating what is obvious. Not if you are married, he said. The silence that followed was of a different quality than the silence before. Denser. The admission hung in the air like smoke. The first time any of them had said it aloud. The first time the truth of what existed between them had been given words and released into the world where it could not be taken back. Society does not recognize that, Rowan said slowly. The law does not recognize it, but we do. He looked at her, and in his ice-gray eyes, she saw something she had never seen there before. Vulnerability. The fortress cracking, not in a single dramatic collapse, but in a slow, deliberate opening. The gates swinging wide because the man inside had decided that what he was protecting was less important than what he was keeping out. He crossed the room and knelt before her. Rowan Callister, a man who dominated every space he entered, who controlled every situation with iron will, who had not bent his knee to anyone or anything since the day he buried his wife and daughter, knelt on the kitchen floor of his own ranch house and looked up at the woman who had crashed into his life and broken every wall he had built to keep the world at bay. Laurel Prescott, he said. His voice was formal in a way that seemed to cost him something, as if the words were being pulled from a place he had sealed shut years ago. I cannot give you normal. I cannot give you society's approval or a conventional life or any of the things a woman like you was raised to expect. I cannot even promise to be the only man in your bed or your heart. His hands found hers, flower-covered fingers wrapped in scarred, calloused palms. But I can promise to protect you, to provide for you, to stand between you and anyone who tries to take you from this mountain. And I can promise to love you until my last breath. Marry me, Laurel, legally. Let me give you the protection that the law recognizes, even if what we are goes far beyond what the law can understand. Tears filled Laurel's eyes, blurring his face, blurring the room, blurring everything except the sensation of his hands holding hers and the sound of his voice saying words she had never expected to hear from anyone, let alone from a man on his knees. What about Jude and Phelan? She whispered. We will have our own ceremony, Jude said, and his voice carried none of its usual hardness. We will make our own vows. Private. Real. The legal marriage is just paper. Protection against the law and your aunt and anyone else who thinks they have the right to decide your life for you. But in our hearts, Phelan added, stepping closer, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder with a warmth that felt like coming home, you are wife to all three of us. Laurel looked at them. 3 men, 3 faces, 3 separate hearts that had each in their own way and at their own pace open to her. And she felt standing in that flower-dusted kitchen with Cordelia's threat cooling on the table and the mountain winter pressing against the windows, the absolute certainty that this was right. Not by any standard she had been taught, not by any rule she had been raised to follow, not by any measurement that Philadelphia or society or the civilized world would ever accept, but right nonetheless, right in the way that breathing is right in the way that sunrise is right in the way that a river finding the sea is right, not because someone decided it should be, but because it simply is. Yes, Laurel said. Yes to all of it. Rowan's face changed. The ice in his eyes did not melt exactly, but it transformed, became something crystalline and clear and beautiful the way ice becomes beautiful when light passes through it and reveals the colors hidden inside. He stood, drew her against his chest, held her the way he had held her that first night when he had pulled her from the mud and carried her through the rain. But this time she was not injured or unconscious or freezing to death. This time she was standing on her own feet, choosing to be held, choosing this man and these men and this life. And that made all the difference. 2 weeks later, on a cold December morning, with snow falling softly outside the windows, a traveling preacher named Reverend Thomas performed a simple ceremony in the main room of the ranch house. Laurel wore a white cotton dress she had sewn herself from fabric Phelan had bought in Copper Bend on the last supply run, simple and clean, and nothing at all like the silk burial shroud hanging in her wardrobe back in Philadelphia. Rowan placed a gold band on her finger. Inside the ring, engraved in letters so small you had to hold it up to the light to read them, were three initials, or JP. The Reverend spoke the words, made the declaration, closed his Bible, and pronounced them husband and wife with the particular expression of a man who sensed something unusual about the ceremony, but could not quite put his finger on what. Rowan kissed her, thoroughly, without apology, with the kind of kiss that made the Reverend look at the ceiling and clear his throat. Then, to the Reverend's visible discomfort, Jude stepped forward and kissed her too, briefly but with an intensity that left no doubt about its meaning. Then Phelan. His kiss was softer, slower, a promise rather than a claim. We are unorthodox, Phelan said to the scandalized preacher as he pressed payment into the man's hands and guided him toward the door. But we are honest. After the Reverend left, moving quickly down the mountain, as if he feared that whatever unconventional spirit inhabited this household might be contagious, the four of them stood in the main room and held their own ceremony. There was no preacher, no Bible, no legal authority, just four people standing in a circle around the hearth, the fire burning high and bright, speaking words that came not from Scripture, but from the heart. Each man made vows to Lauren. Rowan promised protection and devotion. Jude promised honesty and the courage to remain open, even when everything in him wanted to close. Phelan promised partnership and the kind of love that valued her mind as much as her heart, and each gave her a token. Rowan's mother's locket worn smooth by generations of Callister women. Jude's knife, the one he carried every day, the blade sharp enough to cut silk, the handle worn to the exact shape of his palm. Phelan's grandmother's pearls, a string of small, imperfect gems that had traveled from Virginia to Colorado in the pocket of a man who could not bear to leave them behind. Pearls, Laurel whispered, holding them in her palm. She thought of her mother's necklace, lost on the mountainside.